Hello everyone, I am your storyteller, and I'm here to help you. I know that you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The haunting of the Dyatlov Pass. Sometimes the truth is stranger and far more terrifying than fiction. Hello and welcome. Tonight, we'll dive into one of the most mysterious and chilling real-life events in history, the Dyatlov Pass incident. This story takes us deep into the Ural Mountains of Russia in 1959, where 9 experienced hikers, led by Igor Dyatlov, embarked on an expedition that would end in tragedy. Their deaths remain shrouded in mystery, with theories ranging from natural disasters to something far, far darker. But don't worry, I'll tell this story gently, guiding you through the eerie details while helping you relax. So settle in, close your eyes. Let the sound of my voice and the quiet hum of the night carry you into this strange and mysterious tale. Our story begins in January 1959. Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student, assembled a group of 8 friends to join him on a winter trek through the Ural Mountains. They were all experienced hikers, fit and capable, prepared for the harsh conditions of the Russian wilderness. The group included 7 men and 2 women. They were young, hopeful, and excited for the adventure ahead. Their goal was to reach Mount Otorten, a remote peak whose name in the local Mansi language ominously translates to "Don't go there." On January 27th, the group set out from the small village of Vizhai, the last settlement before the wilderness. They laughed, joked, and took pictures as they trekked into the snow-covered expanse. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But as they ventured deeper into the mountains, the weather took a turn. A fierce snowstorm rolled in, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. They decided to set up camp on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, another name with a sinister meaning, Dead Mountain. It would be their final camp. When the group failed to return on schedule, a search party was dispatched on February 20th. What they found would haunt investigators forever. The hiker's tent was discovered first, partially buried in snow. Oddly, it had been slashed open from the inside. Their belongings, boots, jackets, food, were left behind, as though they had fled in a panic. Footprints, some barefoot, led away from the tent and into the freezing wilderness. A few hundred meters away, under a large cedar tree, the first 2 bodies were found. They were shoeless, dressed only in underwear, lying in the snow as if they'd collapsed while trying to light a fire. The branches above them were broken, suggesting one of them had climbed the tree, perhaps in a desperate attempt to look for something or escape from something. Over the next few months, the rest of the bodies were discovered. Some were found in a ravine, buried under several feet of snow. Their injuries were strange. One man had a fractured skull. 2 others had massive chest injuries, like they'd been hit by a car. Yet there were no external wounds, no signs of a struggle. One of the women was missing her tongue, eyes, and parts of her face, but there were no signs of animal scavenging. What could have caused such chaos? And why had they fled their tent, half-dressed in sub-zero temperatures? The official investigation concluded that the hikers died from a compelling natural force. But what exactly that meant has been debated for decades. Some believe an avalanche struck their camp, forcing them to flee in panic. But the slope of the mountain was shallow, and there was no evidence of an avalanche. Others suggest katabatic winds, a rare and powerful weather phenomenon, swept through the area, creating a terrifying roar that sent the hikers running for their lives. But then, there are the stranger theories. The area around Kholat Syakhl was known to be a testing ground for Soviet military experiments. Some speculate the hikers stumbled across a secret weapons test, perhaps a missile or bomb, that caused their bizarre injuries. Others point to reports of strange orange orbs seen in the sky around the time of their deaths. Could they have encountered something extraterrestrial? And then there's the local Mansi legend. Some believe the hikers disturbed a sacred site and were cursed. The Mansi people, however, strongly deny this, saying they respect the mountains but had no reason to harm the hikers. One of the most chilling details of the Dyatlov Pass incident is the state of the hikers' bodies. Despite their severe internal injuries, there were no external wounds. Forensic experts likened the force required to cause such trauma to that of a car crash. Yet there was no evidence of a fall or impact. The missing tongue and eyes of one of the hikers added another layer of horror. Was it scavenging animals or something more sinister? Even stranger were the hikers' clothes. Some of the garments contained traces of radiation, though no one could explain why. And the orange orbs seen in the sky? Multiple witnesses reported them, including other hikers and even Soviet soldiers stationed nearby. In 2019, a new investigation was launched. Researchers concluded that a rare type of small avalanche, called a slab avalanche, might have caused the hikers to flee their tent. But for many, this explanation still doesn't account for the extent of their injuries or the eerie details surrounding their deaths. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved. It's a story that chills the soul and reminds us of the sheer power and mystery of nature, and perhaps of forces beyond our understanding. As you drift off to sleep, let this story settle in your mind. Imagine the quiet of the mountains, the crunch of snow underfoot, the vast, silent expanse of wilderness. The world is full of mysteries, both beautiful and terrifying. But for now, you are safe, you are warm, and soon you will be asleep. Before we unravel more of the mystery, let's pause to remember the 9 hikers as individuals. After all, they weren't just names in a case file. They were real people, with dreams, hopes, and lives full of potential. Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, was known for his determination. His friends said he had a calm, steady demeanor and could solve almost any problem. He loved the outdoors and had a passion for exploring the unknown. In many ways, this trip was his greatest adventure. Zinaida Kolmogorova, one of the 2 women in the group, was described as full of life. She had a sharp wit and a kind heart. Some say she and Igor had a budding romance, though no one knows for sure. Zinaida kept a diary during the trek, and her entries were full of optimism and excitement, until, of course, the final days. Then there was Rustam Slobodin, the quiet thinker of the group. He came from a family of engineers and shared Igor's love for problem solving. He was an experienced hiker and often acted as the group's mediator when tensions ran high. Lyudmila Dubanina, the youngest of the group at 20, was feisty and fearless. Known for her strong opinions, she had a fierce determination that inspired those around her. Ironically, she was also one of the most superstitious members of the group. According to her diary, she often felt uneasy in the wilderness, as though something unseen was watching her. Each of the hikers brought their unique strengths to the group. They were united by a love of adventure, a deep trust in one another, and an unshakable confidence in their abilities. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, they had no idea that something was waiting for them, something they couldn't fight or outrun. Unsettling final moments. The hikers' final days are pieced together from diary entries, photographs, and forensic evidence. On February 1st, the day they set up their final camp, the mood seemed light. They snapped photos, smiling in the snow, and jotted down notes about their progress. But as night fell, something changed. The tent, slashed open from the inside, suggests that the group fled in panic. But why? Some researchers believe they might have heard a terrifying noise, a sudden roar, perhaps from a weather phenomenon or an avalanche. Others suggest the sound was unnatural, like a loud, pulsating hum. Survivors of similar incidents in the wilderness describe the sensation as deeply disorienting, almost like the ground itself is vibrating. Imagine being in their shoes, the howling wind outside, the bitter cold seeping into your bones, and then a noise that doesn't belong, a noise that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. In their panic, the hikers abandoned the safety of their tent, running into the freezing night. But that was only the beginning of their ordeal. The footprints leading away from the tent were erratic, scattered. Some were barefoot, others in socks, and only a few in boots. The group split up, perhaps trying to find shelter or regroup, but as the bitter cold set in, their bodies began to shut down. Under the cedar tree, 2 hikers, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, tried to start a fire. Evidence suggests they ripped branches from the tree with their bare hands, desperate for warmth. But it wasn't enough. Their bodies were found curled up in the snow, frostbitten and lifeless. The others fared no better. Some succumbed to hypothermia, their bodies found in positions suggesting they were trying to crawl back to the tent. Others had injuries so severe they couldn't have survived even if they'd made it to safety. And then there's Lyudmila, her missing tongue and eyes. What could have caused such brutal injuries in the middle of nowhere? When news of the incident spread, it shocked the world. How could 9 skilled hikers meet such a violent and mysterious end? The Soviet government launched an investigation, but their conclusions only deepened the mystery. The official cause of death was listed as an unknown compelling force. No further details were provided, and the case was quietly closed. But for the families of the hikers, and for the many curious minds who have studied the case, this explanation wasn't enough. Over the years, dozens of theories have been proposed, each one more chilling than the last. Some believe the hikers were victims of a secret military experiment. The traces of radiation on their clothing add weight to this theory, as do the reports of glowing orange orbs in the sky. Could the hikers have stumbled upon a classified test site? Perhaps they were exposed to some kind of weapon, or worse, were deliberately silenced to protect a secret. Others point to the strange injuries. The crushed ribs and fractured skulls seem almost impossible to explain. Some researchers suggest an infrasound phenomenon, low-frequency sound waves that can cause feelings of fear, panic, and even physical discomfort. Could an infrasound wave have sent the hikers into a frenzy, driving them out of their tent and into the deadly cold? And then there's the supernatural. The Dyatlov Pass area is steeped in legend, with tales of spirits and curses passed down through generations. Some locals believe the hikers disturbed a sacred site or angered a force they couldn't understand. Of course, there's no scientific evidence to support this, but the idea lingers like a shadow on the mountain. Even today, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved. Every few years, new theories emerge, but none can fully explain the strange combination of injuries, the radiation, and the hikers' erratic behavior. Perhaps the truth lies buried in the snow, hidden forever by the passage of time. But there's one final detail to consider, one that haunts those who study the case. When the hikers' cameras were recovered, investigators found photos of their journey. Most of the images are ordinary: smiling faces, snowy landscapes, the camaraderie of a close-knit group. But then there's the last photo. It's blurry and hard to make out. Some say it shows nothing more than a streak of light, perhaps a camera malfunction. But others see something else, a faint, glowing orb hovering in the sky. Could it be connected to the reports of orange lights seen by other hikers? Or was it just a trick of the camera? The truth is, we may never know. As you drift off to sleep, let this story remind you of the fragility of life and the mysteries of our world. The Dyatlov Pass incident is a chilling tale, but it also speaks to the courage and resilience of the human spirit. Those 9 hikers ventured into the unknown, driven by curiosity and a love of adventure. And perhaps, in the end, that's what makes their story so haunting. It's a reminder that the wilderness is vast and untamed, and that some questions will never be answered. Even decades later, the Dyatlov Pass incident has refused to fade into obscurity. The case has spawned an almost endless array of theories, each with its own chilling implications. But the most compelling ones, those that send a shiver down your spine, are the ones that seem to defy logic. One of the most controversial theories is the idea of a military cover-up. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was deep in the Cold War, testing new weapons and technologies in remote areas far from prying eyes. Some researchers believe the hikers accidentally wandered into the path of a secret military test, perhaps a bomb or a chemical weapon. This could explain the radiation found on their clothing, as well as their bizarre injuries. But if that's true, why did the government allow the case to be investigated at all? And why were some of the bodies left in their strange, exposed positions rather than hidden? Others point to the eerie behavior of the hikers themselves. Before they fled the tent, they had been laughing, playing games, and writing in their diaries. There was no sign of fear or distress. So what could have caused them to suddenly panic? One unsettling theory is that they were exposed to a hallucinogenic substance. Some speculate that gases from the ground, perhaps from volcanic activity or a chemical spill, might have caused them to experience terrifying visions or paranoia. Imagine being trapped in a storm, surrounded by the howling wind and snow. and suddenly feeling like the world is closing in on you. Could this explain why they slashed their way out of the tent and ran into the freezing night? And then there are the more fantastic theories, the ones that stretch the boundaries of belief. Some suggest the hikers encountered a yeti or other cryptid. After all, the region is remote, wild, and largely unexplored, even today. Could they have stumbled upon a creature that didn't want to be found? Others believe the glowing orbs seen in the sky were UFOs, and that the hikers were caught in the crossfire of some kind of extraterrestrial encounter. It's a theory that sounds far-fetched, but when you consider the strange injuries and the radiation, it's hard to dismiss it entirely. A place of shadows, 2-230. The Dyatlov Pass incident has also left a mark on the Ural Mountains themselves. The area where the tragedy occurred is now officially named Dyatlov Pass in honor of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. But for locals, the mountain has always been a place of shadows. The Mansi people, an indigenous group native to the region, have long regarded the area with a mixture of reverence and fear. According to their legends, the mountains are home to spirits who guard the land. These spirits are neither good nor evil. They are simply powerful, and they demand respect. Some believe that the hikers unknowingly angered these spirits by camping on sacred ground. Others think the spirits tried to warn them, but their warnings went unheeded. In the years since the tragedy, other hikers have reported strange occurrences near Dyatlov Pass. Some have heard unexplained noises at night, low, rumbling sounds that seem to come from deep within the earth. Others have seen strange lights in the sky, eerily similar to the ones reported in 1959. And then there are those who speak of an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the air itself is heavy with sorrow. One hiker described it as feeling like you're being watched, even when you're completely alone. Not everyone involved in the Dyatlov expedition met a tragic end. One member of the group, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to a minor illness. He had no way of knowing that his decision would save his life and leave him haunted for the rest of his days. Yuri spent years searching for answers, revisiting the mountains and speaking out about the case. He described his friends as vibrant, intelligent, and full of life, and he struggled to understand how they could have died so violently. "I have no peace," he once said in an interview. "Their voices call to me in my dreams." Yuri's survival raises another question. What if he had stayed with the group? Could he have prevented the tragedy, or would he have simply shared their fate? It's a question he carried with him until his death in 2013, never finding closure. And then there were the searchers, the men and women who found the hikers' bodies. Many of them were deeply affected by what they saw. Some reported nightmares, unable to forget the sight of the tent, torn open and abandoned, or the way the hikers' bodies seemed frozen in time, their faces etched with fear. One rescuer described the scene as something out of a horror movie, and said he felt as though he had stepped into another world, a place where the normal rules no longer applied. As the decades have passed, the Dyatlov Pass incident has taken on a life of its own. Books, documentaries, and even fictional films have been inspired by the tragedy, each one offering a new perspective on what might have happened. Yet for all the speculation, the truth remains elusive. In 2020, Russian authorities reopened the case, citing advances in forensic science and a renewed public interest in the mystery. Their conclusion? A rare type of avalanche, combined with poor visibility and extreme weather, likely forced the hikers to flee their tent. But for many, this explanation feels too convenient. It doesn't account for the radiation, the missing tongue and eyes, or the strange injuries that defy explanation. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Dyatlov Pass incident is that it reminds us of how little we truly know about the world. The Ural Mountains are a place of beauty and danger, a reminder that nature is vast, untamed, and full of secrets. And while science can explain much, there are some mysteries that remain just out of reach, like shadows in the snow, fading as the wind begins to blow. As you lie here, warm and safe, think of the hikers, not as victims, but as adventurers. They were drawn to the mountains by a love of the unknown, a desire to test their limits and explore the edges of the world. Their story is a tragedy, yes, but it's also a testament to the human spirit, the courage to face the unknown, even when it's terrifying. Let their story remind you that life is full of mysteries, some we may never solve, and some we're not meant to. But while there are questions we cannot answer, there's a strange comfort in the unknown. It reminds us of the vastness of the universe, the endless possibilities, and the beauty of the unexplained. So now it's time to let this story rest. Close your eyes. Imagine the quiet of the mountains, the soft crunch of snow, and the gentle whisper of the wind. Let the mystery fade, like footprints disappearing in the snow, until all that's left is peace. Imagine the silence of the mountains after the hiker's final night, the snow-covered slopes, the biting wind, and the eerie stillness that settled over their abandoned tent. What stories could the mountains tell if they could speak? Did they witness what happened that night? Or is the truth buried forever beneath layers of ice, lost to the relentless march of time? The Ural Mountains are ancient, their peaks worn smooth by millions of years of wind and weather. They've seen countless storms, countless lives come and go. To the mountains, the lives of 9 hikers are but a fleeting moment, a ripple in an endless sea of time. And yet their story lingers, as though the mountains themselves are reluctant to let go. For the Mansi people, the mountains are alive. They are spirits, guardians, and keepers of secrets. The name Kholat Syakhl, meaning dead mountain, was not given lightly. Some believe the name is a warning, a reminder that the wilderness is not a place for the unprepared or the unwelcome. But what if the hikers' deaths were not a punishment, but something else? What if the mountains were trying to protect them from something even darker? The searchers who came to Dyatlov Pass in the weeks after the tragedy described a strange feeling, as though the air itself was heavy with sorrow. One of them later wrote in his journal that he felt like an intruder, as though he had stepped into a sacred place where humans were not meant to tread. That feeling, he said, stayed with him for the rest of his life. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become more than just a mystery. It's a riddle that has captured the imaginations of people around the world. Why? Perhaps it's because the story has no clear answers. It invites speculation, forcing us to confront the limits of our understanding. It's a puzzle with too many pieces missing, and that's part of what makes it so haunting. Some researchers have tried to explain the hiker's behavior through psychology. They suggest that extreme cold and exhaustion can lead to paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermia causes people to feel a burning sensation, tricking them into removing their clothing. But this theory doesn't explain the injuries, fractured ribs, a crushed skull, or the missing tongue and eyes. These details resist tidy explanations, leaving us to wonder if we're missing something fundamental. Then there's the question of the glowing orbs. Multiple eyewitnesses, including hikers on nearby mountains and even Soviet military personnel, reported seeing strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident. Were they meteors, secret military flares, or something more unearthly? The images captured on the hikers' cameras show nothing conclusive, but they do show something. Faint streaks of light, barely visible against the black sky. Could these be the same orbs that others reported? Or were they simply an artifact of faulty film, an accidental trick of the camera? And what about the radiation? Traces of it were found on the hikers' clothing, but not all of them, only a select few. Where did it come from? Some believe it points to a secret military experiment, while others think it might have been naturally occurring, perhaps from the granite rocks that make up much of the region. But even this explanation feels incomplete, leaving more questions than answers. There's something unsettling about mysteries that can't be solved. They remind us of how small we are, how much of the world and the universe remains beyond our understanding. The Dyatlov Pass incident isn't just a story about 9 hikers. It's a story about humanity's relationship with the unknown. Why do we feel such a need to explain what happened? Is it because we fear the idea that some things might never make sense? Or is it because we see ourselves in the hikers, their courage, their curiosity, their vulnerability? They went into the wilderness seeking adventure, but they found something else entirely, something they couldn't understand, something they couldn't escape. In a way, their story is timeless. Throughout history, humans have ventured into the unknown, driven by curiosity and a desire to explore. Sometimes these journeys end in triumph. Other times, they end in tragedy. But always, they remind us of the risks we take when we step beyond the boundaries of what we know. The Dyatlov Pass incident forces us to confront a question. What if the unknown isn't just out there in the wilderness, but within ourselves? What if the real mystery is not what happened to the hikers, but why we can't stop thinking about it? Why does it linger in our minds, like a shadow we can't quite see? In the decades since the tragedy, the Dyatlov Pass incident has become a cultural touchstone. It's inspired books, documentaries, films, and even songs. Each retelling adds a new layer to the story, a new interpretation of what might have happened. But none of them can answer the central question. Why did 9 experienced hikers meet such a strange and violent end? Even now, new theories continue to emerge. Some suggest that the hikers might have encountered a rare weather phenomenon known as a snow slab avalanche. This theory gained traction after a 2021 study showed how such an avalanche could explain the tent's damage and the hikers' injuries. But for many, this explanation feels too simple. It doesn't account for the radiation, the missing tongue, or the eerie atmosphere that searchers described. Others believe the hikers were victims of something supernatural, spirits, curses, or otherworldly beings. These theories may seem far-fetched, but they tap into a deep, primal fear, the fear of the unknown, the idea that there are forces in the world that we cannot see, cannot understand, and cannot fight. And then there are those who believe the truth will never be known. Perhaps the Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those mysteries that resists explanation, a reminder that some questions have no answers. Perhaps that's why the story continues to haunt us, because it forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge and the vastness of what we don't understand. And so the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident comes to an end, or does it? In many ways, it feels incomplete, like a book with its final chapter torn out. But maybe that's why it stays with us, why it lingers in our minds long after we've heard it. It's a story without an ending, a puzzle without a solution. As you lie here, warm and safe, think of the hikers. Imagine their laughter as they set out on their journey, their excitement as they climbed higher into the mountains. Remember them not as victims, but as explorers. Brave souls who ventured into the unknown, driven by curiosity and a love of life. And now it's time to let the story rest. Close your eyes. Let the mystery fade like snow melting under the warmth of the sun. The world is full of questions, but for now, you don't need to answer them. All you need to do is breathe, relax, and drift into sleep. The Dyatlov Pass incident is more than just a story of tragedy. It's a reminder of how mysteries have always fascinated humanity. From the earliest days of civilization, people have told stories about the unknown, the strange lights in the sky, the unexplainable sounds in the forest, the travelers who vanished without a trace. The world is full of places like Dyatlov Pass, places that seem to hold secrets just out of reach, where the line between reality and legend begins to blur. But what is it about mystery that captivates us? Perhaps it's the sense of wonder it inspires. To live in a world full of questions is to live in a world full of possibilities. The unknown can be frightening, yes, but it can also be exhilarating. It reminds us that there is so much more to discover about the world, about each other, and about ourselves. The hikers of the Dyatlov expedition were explorers in every sense of the word. They sought to push the boundaries of what they knew, to challenge themselves and connect with the wild, untamed world around them. And though their journey ended in tragedy, their story lives on, inspiring countless others to ask questions, to seek answers, and to dream of the unknown. But with every mystery comes a deeper question. Do we truly want to know the answers? Or is there a part of us that finds comfort in not knowing? Perhaps the allure of the Dyatlov Pass incident isn't just the mystery itself, but the possibility that it may never be solved. It allows us to imagine, to speculate, to wonder, all while leaving the door open to the infinite possibilities of what might have been. As the decades have passed, Dyatlov Pass has become a destination for adventurers and mystery seekers alike. People from all over the world have traveled to the Ural Mountains, drawn by the allure of the unknown. Some come to pay their respects to the hikers, leaving flowers or small tokens at the site where their tent once stood. Others come in search of answers, hoping to uncover clues that might solve the riddle once and for all. But many who visit Dyatlov Pass report strange experiences. Some speak of an overwhelming sense of unease, as though the air itself is charged with something they can't quite explain. Others describe feeling as though they're being watched, even when they know they're alone. And then there are the stories of physical sensations, tingling skin, sudden chills, or a sense of vertigo that comes and goes without warning. Scientists have tried to explain these phenomena, pointing to natural causes like magnetic anomalies or changes in the Earth's electromagnetic field. The Ural Mountains are rich in minerals, and some researchers believe this could create subtle disturbances that affect the human body. But for those who've experienced it firsthand, the feeling is hard to describe, an almost primal sense that something about the place is different. It's easy to dismiss these stories as mere imagination, the product of overactive minds in an eerie setting. But what if they're more than that? What if places like Dyatlov Pass really do hold a kind of energy, something ancient, something we don't yet understand? It's a question that lingers, much like the mystery of the hikers themselves. One of the most haunting aspects of the Dyatlov Pass incident is the sense of inevitability that seems to surround it. As you look back at the events leading up to the tragedy, you can't help but wonder, was it fate that brought the hikers to Kholat Syakhl, or was it merely chance? Consider Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor of the expedition. His decision to turn back was based on something as simple as a sore leg, an ordinary moment, a small choice, that ended up saving his life. What if he had decided to push through the pain? What if he had stayed with the group? Would the outcome have been any different? Or was the tragedy destined to happen, no matter what? And what about the hikers themselves? Their diaries and photographs show a group of young people full of life, each with their own dreams and ambitions. They had no reason to suspect that their journey would end in anything other than success. Yet, as you read their words and look at their smiling faces, there's an almost eerie sense of finality, as though the shadow of their fate was already looming over them. Many who study the Dyatlov Pass incident speak of strange coincidences, small details that seem too uncanny to ignore. For example, the fact that the name of the mountain, Kholat Syakhl, translates to Dead Mountain, or the eerie timing of their journey, which began in the final days of January, a time when the Ural Mountains are at their most unforgiving. These coincidences may mean nothing, or they may mean everything. Either way, they add another layer of mystery to a story that already defies explanation. The human spirit. As strange and haunting as the Dyatlov Pass incident is, it also speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. The hikers may have been young, but they were brave, determined, and full of a deep love for the outdoors. They faced challenges that most of us will never know: freezing temperatures, biting winds, and the harsh isolation of the wilderness. Yet they pressed on, driven by a shared goal and a sense of adventure. Their story is a reminder of the risks we take when we venture into the unknown, but it's also a testament to the power of curiosity, courage, and connection. The hikers were not alone in their final moments. They had each other, and perhaps in some small way, that is a comfort. Even now, their story continues to inspire. It reminds us to ask questions, to seek answers, and to embrace the mysteries of life. It's a story of tragedy, yes, but also of exploration and the unyielding human desire to understand the world around us. And so, we come to the end of this tale, a story that has no true ending, only more questions. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age, a puzzle that continues to captivate and confound. But perhaps that's the way it was always meant to be. Some stories aren't meant to be solved. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. As you lie here, safe and warm, let this story drift away like a snowflake caught in the wind. Imagine the quiet of the mountains, the soft crunch of snow beneath your feet, and the endless sky stretched out above you. Feel the peace of the wilderness, the stillness of a world untouched by time. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts grow quiet. The world is full of mysteries, but for now, you don't need to solve them. All you need to do is rest. The answers can wait for another day. The Haunting of the Blackwood Cabin, a sleep-inducing story based on true events. It was the summer of 1987 when a young couple, Sarah and Mark, decided to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. They rented a charming but somewhat neglected wooden cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains for a month-long getaway. The cabin had stood there for over a century, nestled in the heart of dense forest, surrounded by towering trees and whispering winds. The couple wasn't looking for luxury. In fact, they wanted the opposite, a chance to disconnect from the world, to live simply, and to find some peace away from their demanding jobs. The cabin was the perfect choice. It had no electricity, no phone lines, and was miles away from the nearest town. When they arrived, the first thing they noticed was the stillness. It was almost unnerving how quiet the forest was. No cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind passed through the trees. It felt like the world had paused, holding its breath. But there was something else about the cabin, a feeling that neither Sarah nor Mark could shake. It was subtle, like a faint hum of tension in the air, the kind of feeling you can't explain, but you know it's there. Still, they dismissed it. It was just the unfamiliarity of being so far removed from civilization. Or so they thought. The first day passed uneventfully. They unpacked, explored the surrounding woods, and cooked a simple meal over the fireplace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin was swallowed by darkness. Without electricity, the only light came from the flickering flames of the fire and the soft glow of a few lanterns. The couple went to bed early, lulled by the sound of crickets chirping outside. But as the night deepened, Sarah woke up. She wasn't sure what had stirred her, a dream perhaps, or just the unfamiliar surroundings. She lay there for a moment, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the curtains. That's when she heard it, a faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against wood. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Tap, tap, tap. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound was coming from the front door. "Mark," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Did you hear that?" Mark groaned, half asleep. "It's probably just a branch or something. Go back to sleep." Sarah wasn't convinced, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. She lay back down, trying to ignore the persistent tapping. Eventually it stopped, and she drifted off to sleep. The second day. The next morning, Sarah mentioned the noise to Mark over breakfast. He shrugged it off, teasing her for being spooked so easily. "We're in the middle of the forest," he said. "There's bound to be strange noises." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a branch. She decided to check the area around the cabin. She didn't find any fallen branches near the door, but she did notice something odd, a set of faint footprints in the dirt leading up to the porch. They were small, almost childlike, and they stopped abruptly at the door. Sarah called Mark over, but by the time he came to look, the sunlight had dried the soil, and the prints were barely visible. He dismissed them as animal tracks and suggested they go for a hike to take Sarah's mind off things. The hike was beautiful. The dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden beams. For a while, Sarah forgot about the strange noises and footprints. But as they made their way back to the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but there was nothing there, only shadows and trees. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was knocking on the door. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went to check. He swung the door open, shining the beam into the dark forest. There was no one there, just the trees swaying in the breeze and the soft chirping of crickets. He closed the door, locking it this time, and reassured Sarah that it was probably just an animal. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The tapping had been too deliberate, too human. She barely slept that night, her ears straining for any sound. In the morning, they found something chilling on the porch, a small, hand-carved wooden figure. It was crudely made, but it resembled a person, with two hollow eyes and stick-like arms. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling. "Who would leave this here?" she asked. Mark didn't have an answer. They decided to keep the figurine, thinking it might be important if they needed to report the incident to the authorities. But deep down, they both knew something wasn't right. The legend of the Blackwood cabin. A few days later, they decided to visit the nearest town to pick up supplies and ask about the cabin's history. At the general store, they struck up a conversation with the shopkeeper, an elderly woman who had lived in the area her whole life. When they mentioned the cabin, her expression darkened. "You're staying in the old Blackwood place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The couple nodded, and the woman hesitated before continuing. "That cabin has a history. Back in the 1930s, a family lived there, parents and their young daughter Lily. One winter, the parents went into town for supplies and never came back. Some say they got lost in a blizzard, others think they abandoned her. Either way, the little girl was left alone." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, leaning in. "No one knows for sure," the woman replied. "By the time the townsfolk realized something was wrong, the snow had melted and the cabin was empty. But ever since, people who stay there report strange things, knocking on the doors, childlike footprints, and gifts left on the porch." Sarah and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. "Gifts?" Mark asked. The woman nodded. "Carved figures, mostly, like the ones the little girl's father used to make." That night, back at the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The couple decided to leave the next morning, cutting their trip short. But as they prepared for bed, the tapping started again. This time it was louder than ever, echoing through the cabin. Mark grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, but again there was no one there, just the dense, dark woods. When he turned back toward the cabin, his heart stopped. Standing in the middle of the living room was a figure, a young girl in a tattered dress, her hollow eyes fixed on him. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply pointed to the fireplace. Mark followed her gaze and saw something that hadn't been there before, a small hand-carved figurine, identical to the one they'd found on the porch. When he turned back, the girl was gone. The couple left the cabin at first light, abandoning their belongings in their haste. They never returned, but the memory of that night stayed with them. Years later, Sarah came across an article about the Blackwood cabin. It had been abandoned for decades, but hikers occasionally reported finding small wooden figurines scattered around the property. To this day, no one knows what happened to Lily or who or what still lingers in the shadows of the Blackwood cabin. After Sarah and Mark fled the cabin, they tried to move on with their lives, but something about their experience wouldn't let them go. Sarah, in particular, found herself haunted, not by nightmares, but by a deep, gnawing curiosity. Who was the girl? Why had she appeared to them? And what was the meaning behind the wooden figurines? A few weeks after returning home, Sarah began researching the history of the Blackwood cabin in earnest. At first, her search yielded little beyond local legends and ghost stories. But one night, buried deep in the archives of an Appalachian folklore website, she stumbled across a photograph that made her blood run cold. It was an old, grainy image of a man standing in front of a cabin, their cabin. He held a small wooden figurine in his hand, identical to the ones they had found. Beside him stood a little girl, her face pale and unsmiling, staring directly into the camera. The caption read, "Henry Blackwood and his daughter Lily, c. 1930. Sarah's heart raced as she read the accompanying article. It recounted a version of the story the shopkeeper had told them, but with a chilling addition. In the years following Lily's disappearance, several hikers and travelers had gone missing in the woods surrounding the cabin. Their bodies were never found, but some of their belongings, boots, backpacks, a watch, were discovered near the cabin's porch, as if deliberately placed there. There was also mention of a peculiar local superstition, the belief that anyone who took one of Lily's figurines with them would be marked by her spirit. She follows them, the article warned, waiting for them to return what belongs to her. Sarah froze. The figurine, the one they had taken as evidence, was still sitting on their living room shelf. Sarah couldn't explain why, but after reading the article, the figurine seemed different. Whenever she walked into the room, she felt its presence, as if it were watching her. Mark dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to paranoia, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had brought something back with them. Late one night, as she sat alone in the living room, Sarah decided to examine the figurine more closely. She turned it over in her hands, running her fingers along the rough, weathered wood. That's when she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Carved into the base of the figurine, in tiny, uneven letters, was a single word: Lily. Her stomach churned. She set the figurine down and backed away, her hands shaking. The room felt colder, the shadows longer, and then she heard it: tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the front door. A visit in the night. Sarah froze, her mind racing. It was late, well past midnight. Who or what would be knocking at this hour? For a brief, irrational moment, she thought about ignoring it, but the tapping continued, louder and more insistent. Tap, tap! She grabbed her phone and called for Mark, who was asleep upstairs. He groggily stumbled into the living room, muttering about how it was probably some delivery driver at the wrong house. But when he opened the door, there was no one there, just the empty street, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. Mark closed the door and turned to Sarah, trying to reassure her. See? Nothing to worry about. But as he spoke, they both heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from the direction of the living room. They turned slowly, their eyes landing on the shelf where the figurine had been. It was gone. By now, Mark was starting to take Sarah's concerns seriously. The next morning, they packed the figurine, or what they thought was the figurine, now mysteriously back on the shelf, into a box and drove it to the nearest historical society. They hoped someone there could give them more information. The historian on duty, a middle-aged man named Mr. Caldwell, listened intently as they recounted their story. When they showed him the figurine, his face turned pale. This is one of Henry Blackwood's carvings," he said, his voice trembling. "Where did you find it?" Sarah explained everything: the cabin, the knocking, the girl, and the eerie events that had followed them home. When she finished, Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "There's something you need to understand about Henry Blackwood," he said. "He wasn't just a woodcarver, he was also deeply superstitious. He believed his carvings could act as vessels for spirits, bindings to keep them tethered to this world. Some say he was trying to protect Lily, others think he was trying to control her." Sarah and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. "So what does that mean for us?" Mark asked. Caldwell hesitated. "If Lily's spirit is attached to this figurine, she won't stop until it's returned to her." Despite their fear, Sarah and Mark knew what they had to do. The historian's words echoed in their minds. She won't stop until it's returned. So against their better judgment, they packed the figurine into a bag, loaded up the car, and made the long drive back to the Blackwood cabin. The forest felt even darker and more oppressive than before. The air was thick with tension, and the cabin loomed in the clearing like a silent sentinel, waiting for them. They stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath their feet. Sarah held the figurine tightly, her palms sweaty. "What do we do now?" she whispered. "Leave it by the fireplace," Mark suggested. "That's where we found it." As they stepped inside, the air grew colder. The fireplace was empty, its hearth dark and lifeless. Sarah placed the figurine gently on the stone ledge, her hands trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. The cabin was silent, the only sound their shallow breathing. But then, faintly at first, they heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from all around them, as if the walls themselves were knocking. The temperature dropped further, their breath visible in the icy air. And then, in the corner of the room, they saw her, Lily. She stood there, her hollow eyes fixed on the figurine. Slowly, she reached out, her small, pale hand closing around it. As soon as she touched it, the tapping stopped. The air grew warmer. And just like that, she was gone. Sarah and Mark left the cabin that day and never returned. They sold their house, moved to a new city, and tried to put the experience behind them. But sometimes late at night, Sarah swore she could still hear it, faint, rhythmic knocking, coming from somewhere just out of sight. And in those moments, she couldn't help but wonder, had they truly returned the figurine, or had they brought something else home with them? Months passed, and Sarah and Mark tried to rebuild their lives in their new city. They'd done everything possible to escape the shadow of the Blackwood cabin, moved into a modern apartment far from any woods, avoided discussing the incident, and even threw away anything that reminded them of their terrifying ordeal. But no matter how hard they tried, the memory of Lily and the figurine lingered. Sarah started experiencing vivid dreams, dreams of the cabin, of the cold, hollow-eyed girl standing in the corner, silent but watchful. In the dreams, Sarah always heard the same sound, tap, tap, tap. It followed her, echoing through her subconscious like a warning. At first, Sarah dismissed it as nothing more than residual fear. The mind plays tricks after traumatic events, she reasoned. But as time went on, the dreams became more frequent and more vivid. Then one night, Sarah woke up to something far more unsettling. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart racing. She could feel it. Something was wrong. The room was too quiet, the kind of stillness that weighed heavily on the air. And then she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was closer. It was coming from the closet. "Mark," Sarah whispered, shaking him awake. Her voice was trembling. "Mark, wake up." Mark groaned and rolled over, but when he saw the look on Sarah's face, he immediately sat up. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice groggy but concerned. Sarah pointed to the closet. "Listen." For a moment they both sat in silence, staring at the closed closet door. And then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Mark frowned, trying to find a rational explanation. "It's probably the building settling," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or maybe it's the pipes," Sarah shook her head. "No, it's the same sound, the same tapping from the cabin." Mark's face darkened at the mention of the cabin. He swung his legs out of bed and stood up, grabbing the flashlight he kept on the nightstand. "I'll check," he said, though he didn't sound entirely confident. He approached the closet slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He hesitated for a moment before yanking it open and shining the flashlight inside. The closet was empty. Mark let out a relieved sigh and turned back to Sarah. "See? Nothings." Before he could finish, the light flickered, and then, from deep within the shadows of the closet, they both heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Mark stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam of light rolled across the floor, illuminating something in the corner of the closet, something small and wooden. It was the figurine. The figurine's return. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "How is that possible?" she whispered. "We left it at the cabin. We saw her take it." Mark didn't respond. He was frozen in place, staring at the figurine. Slowly, he bent down and picked it up. It was exactly the same as before, weathered, with the name Lily carved into the base. But now, there was something else. A fresh carving had been added, etched into the back of the figurine. It was a single word: home. Sarah's stomach churned. "She's not done with us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark set the figurine on the dresser and paced the room, his mind racing. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We returned it. We did what the historian said. What more does she want?" Sarah stared at the figurine, her mind replaying every detail of their encounter at the cabin. And then it hit her. "The fireplace," she said suddenly. "We left it at the fireplace, but we didn't bury it." Mark stopped pacing and turned to her. "What are you talking about?" "The historian said Henry Blackwood used the figurines as vessels to bind spirits," Sarah explained. "What if just leaving it there wasn't enough? What if we were supposed to release her?" Mark looked skeptical. "How do we do that?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know, but I think we need to go back." The very thought of returning to the Blackwood cabin filled them both with dread, but they knew they had no choice. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until they dealt with it. The drive back to the Appalachian Mountains was long and tense. The closer they got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, as though it had been waiting for them. Sarah clutched the figurine tightly as they stepped inside. The air was cold, and the familiar sense of unease settled over them immediately. They made their way to the fireplace, the hearth dark and empty. "What now?" Mark asked, his voice low. Sarah knelt by the fireplace, holding the figurine in her hands. "I think we need to burn it," she said. "If it's a vessel, destroying it might release her spirit." Mark nodded and started gathering wood for a fire. As he worked, Sarah placed the figurine on the hearth. She could feel the weight of it, as if it were more than just wood, as if it were alive. When the fire was blazing, Sarah hesitated. "What if this makes things worse?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We don't have a choice." Taking a deep breath, Sarah tossed the figurine into the flames. At first, nothing happened. The figurine sat in the fire, its edges charring and blackening. But then the room grew colder, so cold that their breath was visible in the air. The flames flickered and dimmed, as though struggling against an unseen force. And then they heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, echoing through the cabin. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. And then, from the corner of the room, she appeared. Lily. She stood there, her hollow eyes fixed on the fire. For a moment, she simply watched as the figurine burned. And then, slowly, she turned to Sarah and Mark. Her expression was different this time, not angry or vengeful, but sad. She raised one hand, pointing to the flames, and then, as the figurine crumbled to ash, she began to fade. The tapping stopped, the air grew warmer, and just like that, she was gone. Sarah and Mark left the cabin once again, but this time it felt different. The oppressive weight that had followed them for months was gone. The woods felt lighter, the air easier to breathe. They knew somehow that Lily's spirit had been freed. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the cabin one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing on the porch, a little girl in a tattered dress, watching them leave. But when she blinked, the porch was empty. They never returned to the Blackwood cabin, and they never heard the tapping again. But every now and then, when the wind rustled the trees just right, Sarah thought she could hear a faint echo in the distance. Tap, tap, tap. And now, as the story ends, let your mind drift into the quiet calm of the night. You are safe, warm, and at peace. Let the stillness guide you into a deep, restful sleep. Months passed after the burning of the figurine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah and Mark began to feel a sense of normalcy returning to their lives. The tapping was gone, the dreams had stopped, and the eerie chill that had followed them since their time at the Blackwood cabin had finally lifted. They were able to laugh again, to enjoy quiet nights together without peering over their shoulders, and to believe, truly believe, that the ordeal was over. But some wounds don't heal completely, and some doors, once opened, are impossible to fully close. A strange discovery. It was a rainy afternoon when the first sign appeared, a subtle but chilling reminder that their encounter with Lily was far from over. Sarah had been cleaning out their storage closet, sorting through old boxes to declutter their apartment. She was rummaging through a box of winter clothes when her fingers brushed against something hard and wooden. Her heart sank. Slowly she pulled the object from the box, her breath hitching as she stared at it. It was another figurine, identical to the one they had burned. The same hollow eyes, the same stick-like arms, and the same name carved at its base. Lily. Sarah's hands trembled as she held it. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't possible." Mark found her minutes later, frozen in place, the figurine clutched tightly in her hands. When she explained what she had found, his face went pale. "It can't be the same one," he said, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. "We burned it. We saw it turn to ash." "Then how do you explain this?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking. "How do you explain this?" Mark didn't have an answer. That night, Sarah's nightmares returned. She found herself back at the cabin, the air thick with tension, the firelight flickering against the walls. She was standing in front of the fireplace, staring at the ashes of the figurine. But as she watched, the ashes began to shift and swirl, rising up into the shape of a figure, a small girl with hollow eyes. Lily stepped out of the fireplace, her tattered dress smoldering at the edges. She stared at Sarah, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and anger. And then she whispered, her voice barely audible but piercing all the same, "You didn't finish it." Sarah woke with a start, drenched in sweat. She gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Mark, shaking him awake. "She's back," she said, her voice trembling. "She's not done with us." Mark sat up, rubbing his eyes. "It's just a dream, Sarah," he said, though his tone betrayed his own unease. "You're just scared because of the figurine. That's all." But Sarah knew better. Lily wasn't just a dream. She never had been. Desperate for answers, Sarah and Mark returned to the historian, Mr. Caldwell. When they showed him the new figurine, his reaction was even more alarming than before. He didn't just look pale, he looked frightened. "This shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you burned the original, then this means she's still tethered to you." "What does she want?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We did what you said. We returned the figurine. We released her." Caldwell shook his head. You released part of her, yes, but spirits like Lily's, they don't just move on easily. Her pain, her anger, her sorrow, they're deeply rooted in that place. It's possible that destroying the figurine wasn't enough to sever her connection to this world completely. Then what do we do? Mark asked. How do we stop this? Caldwell hesitated, clearly reluctant to answer. There's an old legend, he began, choosing his words carefully. It said that spirits like Lily's can only find peace if their story is finished. If the wrongs done to them are righted. What wrongs? Sarah demanded. We don't even know what happened to her. Caldwell nodded gravely. Then you need to find out. You need to uncover the truth about what happened to Lily Blackwood. Only then will you have a chance to set her free. Armed with this new information, Sarah and Mark delved deeper into the history of the Blackwood family. They scoured old newspapers, interviewed locals, and even visited the town's library to search through dusty archives. What they uncovered painted a much darker picture than they'd anticipated. Henry Blackwood, the woodcarver, had been a reclusive and deeply troubled man. After his wife died in childbirth, he became obsessed with protecting his daughter, Lily. According to local accounts, he rarely let her leave the cabin, fearing that the outside world would harm her. He carved figurines obsessively, believing they would ward off evil spirits and keep Lily safe. But one winter, something changed. Neighbors reported hearing screams coming from the cabin late at night. Some claimed they saw Henry wandering the woods, muttering to himself and clutching his carvings. And then one day, the cabin went silent. When the townsfolk finally ventured up to the cabin months later, Henry was gone, and Lily was nowhere to be found. The only evidence left behind was a series of figurines scattered around the cabin, their hollow eyes staring out at the forest. The deeper Sarah and Mark dug, the more they began to suspect the horrifying truth. Lily hadn't just been abandoned by her father, she had been murdered. The theory was unconfirmed, but several accounts hinted at it. Some locals believed Henry had lost his mind and killed Lily in a fit of madness, burying her body somewhere on the property. Others believed she had succumbed to the harsh winter, her death a result of her father's negligence. But one thing was clear. Lily's spirit was tied to the cabin because her story had never been resolved. She wasn't at peace because no one had acknowledged the truth of what had happened to her. With this knowledge, Sarah and Mark returned to the cabin one final time, determined to put Lily's spirit to rest. They brought the figurine with them, along with a small wooden box they had prepared. Inside the box, they placed the figurine, along with a photo of Lily and her father that they had found in the archives. They knelt by the fireplace, the air thick with tension. Sarah lit a candle, her hands trembling as she spoke aloud. "Lily," she said softly, "we know what happened to you. We know the pain you endured, and we're so sorry. You deserved love, safety, and peace. We're here to help you find that peace." As she spoke, the room grew colder. The shadows deepened, and the faint sound of tapping began to echo through the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. Mark placed the box in the fireplace and lit the wood beneath it. The flames roared to life, consuming the box and its contents. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it suddenly stopped, and then she appeared. Lily stood before them, her hollow eyes filled with tears. But this time there was no anger, only sadness. She looked at Sarah and Mark for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust them. Then, slowly, she smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. As the flames consumed the box, Lily began to fade, her form dissolving into the light. And then she was gone. The end of the haunting, Sarah and Mark left the cabin for the final time, their hearts heavy but relieved. They knew they had done everything they could to help Lily find peace. And though the memory of her would stay with them forever, they also knew she was finally free. In the weeks that followed, the tapping never returned. The air around them felt lighter, and Sarah's nightmares finally stopped. Lily's story had ended, and with it, the haunting that had plagued them. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Sarah thought she could hear the faintest echo of a sound. Tap, tap, tap. And she hoped it was Lily, finally at peace, saying goodbye. For a while, Sarah and Mark truly believed that their ordeal was over. They settled back into their lives, free from the oppressive weight of Lily's presence. They no longer felt the cold prickle of unseen eyes watching them, and for the first time in months, they could sleep soundly without the faint echo of tapping haunting their nights. But peace has a way of unraveling when the past refuses to stay buried. It started small. Sarah began noticing subtle changes in their apartment, items left in places she was certain she hadn't put them. A book on the coffee table would mysteriously move to the bookshelf. A drawer she knew she had closed would be found slightly ajar. Mark dismissed it, suggesting she was just imagining things, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still lingering. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves outside their window. But as the weeks went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Sarah would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of a child's voice, soft and mournful, calling her name. Sarah. At first she thought it was just a dream, but when Mark began hearing it too, they both knew. Lily wasn't gone. Signs of her return. The whispers were only the beginning. Soon the tapping returned. It started sporadically, a faint tap, tap, tap that seemed to echo through the walls, but it wasn't coming from the doors or windows this time. It was coming from inside the apartment. One night, as they sat in the living room, the tapping grew louder. Mark was the first to notice it, his face turning pale as he glanced toward the kitchen. The sound was coming from the pantry door. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They both stared at the pantry, neither of them daring to move. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, and then it stopped. For a long moment, the apartment was silent. But just as they began to relax, the door creaked open, slowly, as though pushed by an invisible hand. Sarah screamed, and Mark jumped to his feet, grabbing a flashlight. He shone the beam into the pantry, but it was empty. There was nothing inside except for their canned goods and dry food. But on the floor, resting in the middle of the pantry, was something that hadn't been there before. Another figurine. This figurine was different from the others. It was larger, more detailed, and far more sinister. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, and its expression was twisted into a grimace of pain. Carved into its chest were the words, "Help me." Sarah picked it up carefully, her hands trembling. "She's trying to tell us something," she said, her voice shaking. "She's still trapped. We didn't set her free." Mark shook his head, pacing the room. "No, this doesn't make sense. We burned the figurine. We gave her peace. What else could she possibly want?" Sarah stared at the figurine, her mind racing. "Maybe we were wrong," she said softly. Maybe there's something else keeping her here." Desperate for answers, they returned to Mr. Caldwell at the Historical Society. When they showed him the new figurine, his face darkened. "This isn't just about Lily anymore," he said grimly. "I think you've uncovered something far more dangerous." He pulled out a dusty old book from his archives, flipping through its pages until he found what he was looking for. He laid the book on the table, revealing an old, hand-drawn map of the Blackwood property. Mark and Sarah leaned in, studying the map closely. "This," Caldwell said, pointing to a spot marked with an X near the cabin, "is where the Blackwood family burial ground is located. Henry Blackwood didn't just lose his mind. He was cursed. The Blackwoods were rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals, binding their souls to the land in an attempt to achieve immortality. But instead of eternal life, they became trapped, caught between this world and the next." Sarah's heart sank. "So Lily isn't the only one bound to the cabin?" Caldwell shook his head. "No, and if the figurines are reappearing, it means the curse is still active. Lily may have been the first spirit you encountered, but she's not the only one tied to that place. The Blackwoods are still there, and they're not going to let you go until the curse is broken." Mark frowned. "How do we break it?" Caldwell hesitated. "You have to destroy the source. The burial ground is the anchor. If you can find it and perform a cleansing ritual, you might be able to sever their ties to this world." Reluctantly, Sarah and Mark prepared for one final trip to the Blackwood property. This time, they came armed with everything Caldwell had recommended: salt, sage, candles, and a copy of the cleansing ritual. They also carried shovels, knowing they would need to dig into the burial ground to complete the ritual. The drive to the cabin was eerily quiet. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees looming like silent sentinels. When they arrived, the air was heavy with tension. and the cabin felt alive, as though it were watching them. They didn't waste time. Using the map Caldwell had given them, they made their way to the burial ground, which was hidden deep in the woods behind the cabin. The area was overgrown with weeds, the gravestones weathered and cracked. The air was colder here, the ground damp and soft beneath their feet. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it ends." They began the ritual by lighting the candles and sprinkling salt in a circle around the burial ground. Mark read aloud from the book, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. As he spoke the incantation, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew colder. And then they heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from all around them, echoing through the forest. Shadows moved between the trees, flickering at the edges of their vision. Sarah clutched the sage tightly, her hands trembling. "Keep going," she shouted over the wind. Mark continued reciting the incantation, his voice growing louder and more confident. The tapping grew more frantic, more desperate, until it was almost deafening. And then, with a final word, the ritual was complete. The wind stopped, the tapping ceased, the forest fell silent. For a moment, Sarah and Mark stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then, slowly, the shadows began to fade. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warm again. They had done it. The curse was broken. As they packed up their supplies, Sarah glanced back at the burial ground. For a brief moment she thought she saw a figure standing among the gravestones, a little girl in a tattered dress, her hollow eyes now filled with peace. Lily smiled at her, a bittersweet expression that seemed to say thank you. And then she was gone. Sarah and Mark never returned to the Blackwood cabin, but for the first time they felt truly free. The tapping, the whispers, the cold presence, all of it was gone. They could finally move on, knowing they had done everything they could to bring peace to Lily and the others bound by the Blackwood curse. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would think about the cabin and the dark woods surrounding it. She would wonder if the curse was truly broken, or if some part of it still lingered, waiting for someone else to stumble upon its secrets. And in those moments, she thought she could almost hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The haunting of Cold Hollow Road. There's a stretch of road in the middle of Vermont's dense forests called Cold Hollow Road. Most people around the area know better than to travel it after dark. The locals whisper about the road in hushed tones, especially in the colder months when the snow begins to pile up and the nights stretch long and quiet. They'll tell you about the people who've gone missing driving along that road. They'll tell you about the strange sounds that echo through the woods, about the lights that flicker in the trees, and about the figure that people swear they've seen standing just beyond the shoulder, staring blankly out into the darkness. I didn't believe in any of it. Not at the time, anyway. I was a skeptic, the kind of person who laughed at ghost stories and chalked up bumps in the night to creaky pipes or shoddy construction. But life has a way of humbling you, and Cold Hollow Road did just that. I'm telling this story now because people need to know. They need to understand that some things can't be explained, that some places are better left alone. It started one cold November evening. My friend Ben and I were driving back from a hiking trip in the Green Mountains. We'd spent the day climbing trails, taking pictures, and enjoying the crisp autumn air. By the time we got back to the car, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. We were exhausted, but in good spirits. The kind of tired contentment that comes after a day well spent. Ben was the one who suggested we take Cold Hollow Road. He said it would shave at least 20 minutes off our drive home, and we'd been on the road for hours already. I hesitated. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone around here had. But I didn't believe in ghosts, and I wasn't about to admit I was nervous over some silly local lore. So, I agreed. The first stretch of the road was uneventful. The trees were thick and close, their bare branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness, illuminating the gravel road ahead. It was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars to pass, and the edges were lined with ditches filled with dead leaves and stagnant water. Ben was talking about something, work, I think, but I wasn't really listening. There was something about the road that demanded my attention, something that made me feel uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Then we saw her. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a coyote, something standing just at the edge of the road where the trees met the gravel. But as we got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, her back to us, her long hair hanging down over her shoulders. She wore a pale dress, thin and out of place in the chilly November air. Ben slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move at all. She just stood there, staring into the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something wrong about her, something I couldn't quite put into words. Ben glanced at me, his brow furrowed. "Should we stop?" he asked. I shook my head. "Let's just keep going." Ben hesitated, but then he nodded and rolled up the window. As we drove past her, I couldn't help but look back. She hadn't turned around. She hadn't moved at all. She just stood there, a pale figure in the darkness, her hair hiding her face. The air in the car felt heavy after that. Ben tried to make a joke about weirdos in the woods, but it fell flat. Neither of us was in the mood to laugh. The road seemed darker now, the trees closing in tighter, their branches scraping against the roof of the car. The headlights barely seemed to pierce the gloom, and the gravel crunched loudly beneath the tires. We didn't see the woman again, but the sense of unease lingered. It felt like we were being watched, like there were eyes in the trees, following our every move. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the road behind us, but there was nothing, just darkness. Then the radio started acting up. It had been playing softly in the background, some classic rock station that Ben liked. But now it was crackling with static, the music cutting in and out. Ben frowned and reached for the dial, trying to adjust it, but the static only got louder. And then, through the static, we heard a voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer, until we could make out the words. "Help me." Ben froze, his hand on the dial. We looked at each other, our eyes wide. Then the voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Help me, please." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the back seat. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. The back seat was empty. Of course it was. But for a moment, just a split second, I thought I saw something. A shadow, a shape, something that didn't belong. And then it was gone. Ben didn't say anything. He just turned the radio off and kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I could tell he was scared, though he was trying not to show it. I didn't blame him. I was scared too. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless tunnel of darkness and trees. The air in the car felt colder now, and I found myself shivering despite the heater blasting warm air. The unease had turned into full-blown fear, a primal, gut-wrenching terror that I couldn't explain. And then the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, and the headlights flickered out, plunging us into darkness. Ben cursed under his breath and tried the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the faint creak of branches swaying overhead. "We should call for help," I said, my voice trembling. Ben nodded and reached for his phone, but he cursed again. No signal. I pulled out my own phone. Same thing. No bars. We were completely cut off. We sat there for a moment, neither of us knowing what to do. And then we heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my side. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, just darkness. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Ben nodded, his eyes wide. The tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow shifting just beyond the edge of the trees. It was her, the woman in the white dress. She was standing there, staring at us, her face hidden by her hair. "Go," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to go." Ben didn't argue. He turned the key again, and this time the engine roared to life. The headlights came on, and for a brief moment, the woman was illuminated in the beam. Her face, it was wrong. Twisted, hollow, her eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light. And then she was gone, vanishing into the trees as quickly as she'd appeared. Ben didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward. gravel spraying out behind us. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just drove, the road winding and twisting beneath us, until finally, mercifully, we saw the lights of the main highway. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. Not that night, not ever. But I know we both saw the same thing, and I know we were lucky to get out of there alive. I've never been back to Cold Hollow Road. I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about it. I dream about the woman in the white dress, standing there in the darkness, her face hidden by her hair. And I wonder how many others weren't so lucky. How many others are still out there, trapped in the woods, waiting for someone to help them. So if you ever find yourself in Vermont and someone suggests taking a shortcut down Cold Hollow Road, don't do it. Take the long way. Trust me, it's not worth the risk. I thought that would be the end of it. For years, I avoided Cold Hollow Road like the plague. Just thinking about that night made my stomach churn and my palms sweat. But the thing about fear is that it has a way of lingering, even when you think you've left it behind. It festers quietly, like a splinter buried under the skin, and sometimes, no matter how much time passes, it finds a way to come back. I didn't talk to Ben much after that night. We drifted apart, and I think it was because neither of us wanted to face what had happened. It was easier to pretend it didn't exist, to pretend we hadn't seen what we'd seen. But pretending only works for so long. It was almost 5 years later when I got the phone call. It was late, well past midnight, and I was already half asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was Ben. We hadn't spoken in years, and seeing his name pop up out of the blue sent a jolt through me. Ben, I answered, my voice thick with sleep. What's going on? There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard him breathing, shallow, shaky breaths. It's happening again, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? Cold Hollow Road, he said. I've been back. I've seen her again. My stomach tightened. I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that he shouldn't have gone back, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I asked, why were you out there? I don't know, he said, and his voice cracked. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about her. It's like she's been pulling me back. I've been having these dreams, man, night after night, and it's her, always her. I thought if I went back, maybe it would stop. Maybe I could figure out what she wants. Ben, you shouldn't have gone back, I said. You know what happened last time. I know, he said, but it's worse now, so much worse. What do you mean? I asked, though deep down I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling. She's not alone. I felt the blood drain from my face. What do you mean? There are others, he said. I saw them, in the woods. They were just standing there, watching me. I don't think they're alive, man. I think they're like her. Ben, listen to me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You need to stay away from that place. Do you hear me? Don't go back. I can't, he said. It's too late. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, clutching the phone, my mind racing. I should have called him back, but I didn't. I was too scared. And when I tried calling the next morning, his phone went straight to voicemail. I didn't hear from Ben again after that. A week later, I found out he was missing. His car was found abandoned on the side of Cold Hollow Road, the driver's side door wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading into the woods. It was like he'd just vanished. The police launched a search, but they didn't find anything. Not Ben, not his phone, not even a scrap of clothing. It was like he'd been swallowed up by the forest. I wanted to tell them what I knew, but what could I say? That my friend had been lured to his death by some ghostly woman? They'd think I was insane. For weeks after Ben disappeared, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those hollow, black eyes staring back at me. And worse, I started to hear things. It started softly, just a faint whispering at the edge of my awareness. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, like someone begging for help. And then the tapping started. It was late one night, not long after Ben's disappearance. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it. Tap! 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 It was coming from the window. My room was on the second floor, and there was no way anyone could be standing outside. but the sound was unmistakable. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The tapping came again, louder this time. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, I turned my head to look at the window. She was there. Her face was pressed against the glass, her black eyes staring straight at me. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just lay there, paralyzed, as she stared at me, and then she was gone. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was streaming through the window, and there was no sign of her. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it. Over the next few weeks, the whispers grew louder. They followed me everywhere, at home, at work, even in my car. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, shapes that vanished the moment I turned to look. I was barely sleeping, barely eating. I felt like I was losing my mind. And then, one night, I got in my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going at first. I just needed to get out, to escape the suffocating weight of whatever was haunting me. But as I drove, I realized where I was headed. Cold Hollow Road. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around, but I couldn't. It was like something was pulling me there, dragging me back to that cursed place. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. By the time I reached the road, I could barely breathe. I don't remember much of the drive. The trees loomed over me, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The headlights barely seemed to penetrate the darkness, and the gravel crunched loudly beneath the tires. I kept expecting to see her, standing at the edge of the road, but she never appeared, and then the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, just like it had all those years ago. The headlights flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then I heard it, the tapping. It came from the passenger side window this time. Slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head, and there she was. Her face was inches from mine, her black eyes boring into me. Her mouth was moving again, but this time I could hear her. "Help me," she whispered. "Please." I don't know what happened after that. The next thing I remember, I was standing in the middle of the road, the car nowhere in sight. The woods were silent, and the air was so cold it burned my lungs. I don't know how I made it out of there, but somehow I did. I never went back. I moved across the country, put as much distance between myself and Cold Hollow Road as I could. But I know it's not over. I still hear the whispers sometimes late at night, and every now and then I'll catch a glimpse of her in the corner of my eye. I don't know what she wants. I don't think I ever will, but I know one thing for sure. She's not done with me. Not yet. I moved to California, hoping the distance would make a difference. I wanted to believe that the terror of Cold Hollow Road could only reach so far, that whatever haunted that stretch of cursed land couldn't follow me across the country. For a while, it seemed to work. The whispers faded, the shadows stopped creeping into my periphery, and I started to feel normal again, or at least as normal as anyone could feel after what I'd been through. Months passed. I got a new job, made a few friends, even started dating someone. Her name was Emily, and for the first time in years, I thought I might be able to move on. I didn't tell her about what had happened. How could I? What would I say? That a ghost, or whatever she was, had been following me since I drove down a back road in Vermont. That my best friend had vanished, and that I was terrified it might happen to me. No, I couldn't. I wanted to keep Emily safe, and I thought the best way to do that was to keep her out of it entirely. For a while, life was good. I thought I'd escaped. I thought maybe the distance had worked. But as the weeks turned into months, the nightmares started again. They were always the same. I was back on Cold Hollow Road, standing in the middle of the dark forest. The air was cold, so cold it burned, and I could hear her voice whispering my name. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there, just out of sight, waiting, watching. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the sound of her voice echoing in my ears. Emily would ask if I was okay, and I'd lie. I'd tell her it was just a bad dream, nothing to worry about. But the truth was, I could feel her getting closer. It was like a shadow creeping back into my life, slow and inevitable. Then one night, Emily woke me up. It was around 3 a.m., and I'd been in the middle of another nightmare. I was standing in the woods again, hearing her voice, feeling her presence. But this time there was something new. A light. It was faint at first, but it grew brighter, flickering and dancing through the trees like firelight. And then I heard the voices. Not just hers, but others, dozens of them, overlapping, whispering, crying, begging. The light grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding, and then I woke up to Emily shaking me. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I sat up, still groggy, my heart racing. "Hear what?" She looked toward the window. There was tapping on the glass. My blood ran cold. I turned to look at the window, half expecting to see her face staring back at me, but there was nothing there, just the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains. "It was probably a branch," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Or maybe an animal." Emily didn't look convinced. "It sounded like fingers," she said, "like someone tapping." I forced a smile. "You're just imagining things. Go back to sleep." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. The tapping started again the next night, and the night after that. Emily would hear it, but I wouldn't, at least not at first. She started getting spooked, saying she felt like someone was watching us, like there was something in the apartment with us. I tried to reassure her, but deep down, I knew what was happening. She was getting closer. I'd brought her with me. A few weeks later, Emily woke me up again. This time, she was crying. "She's here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I sat up, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "She's standing in the hallway," Emily said, her eyes wide with terror. I saw her. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see her again. But I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way to the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, but I could feel it. The oppressive, suffocating presence I'd felt so many times before. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling. When the light flicked on, the hallway was empty, but the air was freezing, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. It was the same smell I'd noticed on Cold Hollow Road all those years ago. "She was there," Emily said from behind me. I swear she was there. I believed her. I didn't say it, but I believed her. That was the night I told Emily everything. I told her about Cold Hollow Road, about the woman in the white dress, about Ben. I told her about the whispers, the shadows, and the dreams. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, staring at me, her face pale. "You should have told me," she said finally. "You should have told me before." "I didn't want to drag you into it," I said. "I thought I could protect you." "Well, you didn't," she snapped, tears streaming down her face. "She's here now, isn't she? She's here because of you." She was right. I'd thought I could run from it, but all I'd done was bring it with me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. The next few weeks were a blur. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. The whispers came back, and this time, Emily could hear them too. Shadows moved through the apartment, darting just out of sight. The air grew colder, the smell of damp earth stronger. It was like the apartment was rotting from the inside out. Emily couldn't take it. She moved out, and I didn't blame her. I told her to go, told her to get as far away from me as she could. I didn't want her to end up like Ben. I didn't want her to disappear. After she left, the activity got worse. The whispers turned into screams. The shadows turned into figures. Pale, hollow-eyed figures that stood at the foot of my bed, watching me as I slept. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to go back. I booked a flight to Vermont the next day. When I arrived, I rented a car and drove straight to Cold Hollow Road. It was just as I remembered it, narrow, winding, and lined with skeletal trees. The air was cold and heavy, and the smell of damp earth was overwhelming. I parked the car on the side of the road and got out. The forest was silent. Not a single bird, not a single rustle of leaves, just silence. And then I heard her voice. "Help me," she whispered. "Please." I turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the trees. Her white dress was dirty and torn, and her long hair hung in tangled strands over her face. Her black eyes stared at me, empty and endless. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. "Why won't you leave me alone?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me. And then slowly she turned and began walking into the woods. I don't know why I followed her. Maybe I thought I could end it, finally put a stop to everything. Maybe I thought I could save her. Or maybe I just didn't have a choice. Her presence was like a magnet, pulling me forward, deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. The ground was soft and muddy, and with every step I felt like I was sinking. The whispers started again, louder now, overlapping, coming from all directions. And then I saw them. They were standing in a clearing, dozens of them. Pale figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces, their bodies barely more than shadows. They stood in a circle, their heads turned toward me, their voices blending into a cacophony of whispers and screams. She was in the center of the circle, staring at me with those empty black eyes. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. And then suddenly, everything went silent. She raised her hand and pointed at me. The figures began to move, stepping closer, their eyes locked on mine. I tried to run, but the ground seemed to swallow my feet. The last thing I remember is her face, those hollow eyes, that twisted mouth, and the sound of her voice. "Help me," she whispered. "Please." And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road. My car was gone, my phone was dead, and my clothes were soaked with mud. I don't know how I got out of there. I don't know why they let me go. But I know one thing, it's not over. It will never be over. She's still out there, waiting, watching, and I think one day she's going to take me back. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, that I left Cold Hollow Road behind me for good, that I found a way to move on, that I was free. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I've come to understand something about her, about them. They don't let go. Not really. Once you've seen her, once you've felt her pull, she's with you. Forever. After I woke up on the side of the road that night, I stumbled my way back to town. It was early morning, the sky just beginning to lighten, though the sun hadn't yet risen. I must have looked like I'd been dragged through hell, a man caked in mud, shivering, eyes hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. But no one asked any questions. They just looked at me, their faces pale, and kept their distance. I managed to hitch a ride to the nearest bus station and made my way back to California. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not Emily, not my family, not the few friends I still had left. I was too afraid they'd see it on me, that they'd hear the truth in my voice and somehow get pulled into it too. I couldn't do that to anyone else. Not after what happened to Ben. Not after Emily. So I bottled it up. I told myself I was fine, that I was stronger now, that I could keep her at bay. But the thing about her is that she doesn't need to be seen to be felt. She's patient. She waits. At first, it was in the small things. A faint whisper when I turned off the lights at night. A shadow that seemed to move in the corner of my eye. That smell of damp earth returning just when I thought I'd forgotten it. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was all in my head, but the truth is I could feel her getting closer. Every day, she crept a little nearer, and every day I felt a little less like myself. The nightmares came back in full force, worse than ever. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It wasn't just her. It was them. The pale figures with their hollow eyes, standing in that circle, whispering, watching. And every time I dreamed of them, I woke up feeling like they'd taken something from me. Something I couldn't name, but that left me feeling emptier, like I was slowly unraveling. And then there was the tapping. It started again a few months after I got back. Always at night, always on the window, no matter where I was. It didn't matter if I was on the second floor of an apartment building or staying in a hotel room on the 10th floor. The tapping would come. Soft at first, tap, 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 and then louder, more insistent, just like it had been before. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I stopped living. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. And every time I opened them, I felt her presence, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. I tried to drown it out. I drank. I took sleeping pills. I even tried to overdose once, just to make it stop. But it didn't work. She wouldn't let me go. The pills knocked me out, but the dreams were worse. So vivid, so real, that when I woke up, I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming, or if she'd finally pulled me into her world for good. And then one day, I heard Ben's voice. I was in my apartment, sitting on the couch, trying to convince myself to eat something when I heard it. Faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator, but unmistakable. "Help me," I froze. My heart felt like it stopped in my chest. It came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was coming from the living room. from the corner where the shadows always seemed to linger, just out of reach of the light. "Ben?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadows shifted. For a moment, I thought I saw him. His face pale and sunken, his eyes hollow and lifeless. And then he was gone. I don't know why, but that was the moment I broke. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live like this, haunted, hunted, waiting for the day she finally came for me. I needed answers. I needed to know why this was happening, what she wanted, why she wouldn't just leave me alone. So I started looking into it, researching, digging through old newspapers, online forums, anything I could find that mentioned Cold Hollow Road or the woman in white. Most of it was the same old ghost story nonsense, urban legends, campfire tales, things that couldn't possibly prepare me for what I'd actually experienced. But every now and then, I'd find something, a pattern. The disappearances went back decades, maybe even longer. People vanishing without a trace, their cars found abandoned on the side of the road. Some were hikers, some were locals, some were just passing through. But they all had one thing in common. They'd all been on Cold Hollow Road. And then there were the sightings. The woman in the white dress, the tapping, the whispers. People had seen her, people had heard her, but no one had ever explained her. No one knew who she was or where she'd come from. Some said she was the ghost of a woman who'd been murdered there decades ago. Others said she was something older, something darker, something that had always been there, waiting in the woods. The more I learned, the more obsessed I became. I knew I was putting myself in danger, but I didn't care. I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what had happened to Ben, to Emily, to me. That's how I found the cabin. It was mentioned in an old forum post, buried deep in a thread about Cold Hollow Road. Some guy claimed he'd found it while hiking in the area, an old, rotting cabin hidden deep in the woods. He said it felt wrong, like the air around it was heavier, like the trees were watching him. He didn't stay long, but he swore he'd seen something inside. A figure, standing in the doorway, watching him. I knew I had to find it. It took me weeks to plan. I couldn't just show up and hope for the best. I needed maps, supplies, a way to navigate the dense forest that surrounded Cold Hollow Road. I knew I was walking into danger, but I didn't care. I was already dead inside. She'd made sure of that. When I finally arrived, the road was just as I remembered it, narrow, winding, suffocating. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching for the sky like skeletal fingers. I parked the car in the same spot where Ben's had been found all those years ago and stepped into the woods. The air was cold and thick, and every step felt like a struggle. The deeper I went, the darker it got, until it felt like the trees were closing in around me. I followed the directions from the forum post, my heart pounding with every step. And then, after what felt like hours, I saw it. The cabin. It was old, its wooden walls rotting and covered in moss. The windows were broken, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. But the air around it was heavy, electric, and I knew I wasn't alone. I stepped closer, my hands trembling, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The door creaked open, and I heard her voice. "Help me." I stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was worse than I could have imagined. The air was thick with the smell of damp rot and something else, something metallic and sharp, like blood. The walls were warped and blackened, and the floor sagged beneath my weight, groaning with every step. It felt like the whole place was alive, like it was breathing, watching. My flashlight flickered, the beam trembling as I moved it across the room. There were symbols carved into the walls, strange, jagged shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them too long. They weren't anything I recognized, no language, no pattern, just chaos etched into the wood. The floor was littered with debris, rotting furniture, shattered glass, and what looked like fragments of bone. I didn't want to think about where the bones had come from. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was a circle, burned into the wood. It was black as charcoal, the edges jagged and uneven, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. There was something in the circle, a small bundle of cloth, dark with stains. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The bundle looked human-shaped, like a child curled up in the fetal position, but it didn't move. I wanted to leave, to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I felt like I was being pulled closer, drawn in by an invisible force. Help me. Her voice came again, soft and pleading, but this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the bundle in the circle. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn back, to get out of there. But I couldn't. I was shaking so hard I thought I might drop the flashlight, but I forced myself to move closer. The bundle twitched just slightly, and a low, guttural sound escaped from it, like a groan or a breath. My stomach turned, but I couldn't stop. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled back the edge of the cloth. The thing inside wasn't human. At least, not anymore. Its skin was gray and shriveled, stretched tight over bone. Its face was twisted, its mouth frozen in a silent scream, and its eyes were black pits, just like hers. It looked ancient, decayed, like it had been here for centuries, but it was still moving. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and its fingers twitched, clawing weakly at the air. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, and then I felt it. The air shifted, growing colder, heavier. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils, and I knew she was here. I turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Her white dress hung in tatters, the fabric stained with dirt and something darker. Her hair was wild, tangled, hiding most of her face. But her eyes, those black, hollow eyes, bored into me, pinning me in place. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the rotting floorboards. Why? I managed to choke out. Why are you doing this? Her head tilted slightly, like she was considering the question. Then slowly, she raised her hand and pointed at the circle in the center of the room, at the thing inside it. Help me, she whispered. I shook my head, backing away. I don't understand. What do you want from me? She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. Her arm remained outstretched, pointing at the circle. And then, for the first time, I saw her face. It was worse than I'd imagined. Her skin was pale and waxy, stretched over sharp, angular features. Her mouth was too wide, her lips cracked and bleeding, and her teeth were jagged, uneven, like shards of broken glass. But it was her eyes that froze me in place. Those black, empty voids seemed to swallow the light, pulling me into their darkness. I couldn't look away. Help me, she said again, louder this time, her voice echoing through the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help her, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But the pull was stronger now, the invisible force dragging me toward the circle. My legs moved on their own, carrying me closer to the thing in the center of the room. The whispers started again, louder, overlapping, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I knelt beside the circle, my hands trembling. The thing inside the bundle twitched again, its head turning slightly toward me. Its mouth opened, and for a moment I thought it might speak, but instead it let out a low, guttural moan that sent chills down my spine. What do you want me to do? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the air around me seemed to vibrate with energy. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the bundle, and the moment I touched it, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the cabin, the flashlight flickering weakly in my hand. The circle was gone, the bundle was gone, and so was she. I thought I'd escaped. I thought it was finally over. But as I stumbled out of the cabin and back into the woods, I realized I was wrong. The forest was different now. The shadows were darker, deeper, and the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches clawing at me as I passed. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. And then I saw them. They were everywhere, pale figures standing among the trees, their hollow eyes watching me. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating. They were waiting. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back to the road, but somehow I did. My car was still there, though the windows were fogged over and the air inside smelled like damp earth. I didn't care. I just got in and drove, not looking back, not stopping until I was miles away. But even now I know I didn't escape. I can still feel her, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. The tapping has started again. The whispers follow me everywhere, and sometimes late at night I see them, the pale figures with their hollow eyes standing in the shadows, watching. I don't know what they want. I don't know what I brought back with me, but I know one thing for sure. It's not over. It will never be over. It was the summer of 1989 when the strange events began in the small, unassuming town of Rosedale, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Rosedale was one of those places where nothing extraordinary ever happened, the kind of town that didn't even make it onto most maps. Its population hovered around a few hundred, and everyone knew everyone. It was the sort of place where folks left their doors unlocked at night, where the hum of crickets and rustling leaves were the only sounds after dark. But that summer changed everything. It started with the disappearance of a local woman, Martha Klein. She was a school teacher in her 40s, beloved by her students and respected in the community. She had no enemies, no reason to leave. One evening, she told a neighbor she was heading to the woods behind her house to gather some wildflowers, a habit of hers. When she didn't return by nightfall, her husband Dale went looking for her. He found her car parked at the edge of the forest, her basket sitting on the hood, but Martha was nowhere to be found. The search for Martha stretched on for weeks. Volunteers combed the woods, calling her name, but there was no trace of her, not even a single footprint. The only odd thing anyone noticed was that the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if even the birds and insects were avoiding it. The search was eventually called off, and whispers of something sinister began to spread through the town. Some said she'd run off, though those who knew her best swore she wouldn't have done that. Others started murmuring about the woods themselves, about how people had always avoided venturing too far into them. There were stories, old ones, about strange happenings in those trees, but no one had paid them much mind, until then. 2 months after Martha's disappearance, a group of teenagers decided to test their courage. It was a warm August night, and the group, 4 boys and 2 girls, dared each other to spend the night in the woods where she'd vanished. Armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and a bottle of cheap whiskey, they made their way into the forest, laughing and joking as they went. They set up camp in a small clearing about a mile in, and for the first few hours, everything was fine. They told ghost stories, passed the bottle around, and teased each other about who'd chicken out first. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling began to settle over the group. The laughter died down, and they started to notice how quiet it was. Too quiet. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. One of the girls, Lisa, swore she heard faint whispering coming from the trees, but the others brushed it off, blaming the whiskey. Around midnight, they heard it, a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees. The boys tried to act brave, shining their flashlights into the darkness, but the beams seemed swallowed by the blackness. Then one of the boys, Eric, screamed. The others turned to see him clutching his leg, his face pale. Something had scratched him, 3 deep, parallel gashes that oozed blood. But there was no sign of an animal, no movement in the underbrush. Panicked, they decided to leave. They grabbed their things and hurried back toward the edge of the woods. But no matter which direction they went, they couldn't find their way out. It was as if the forest was shifting around them, leading them deeper instead of letting them leave. Lisa claimed later that she felt something watching them, following just out of sight. When they finally stumbled out of the woods at dawn, they were scratched, bruised, and terrified. Eric had to be hospitalized for his wound. It had become infected, though the doctors couldn't explain why. The group never spoke about what happened that night, not publicly. But around town, the stories began to spread. People whispered about the curse of the woods, about something ancient and malevolent that lived among the trees. Over the next few months, more strange events occurred. A farmer found his cattle mutilated in their pasture, their bodies arranged in a perfect circle. A hunter disappeared, his rifle discovered leaning against a tree as if he'd simply walked away. And then there were the sightings. Shadowy figures glimpsed at the edge of the forest, eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness, and a woman's voice calling faintly for help, always just out of reach. The town's sheriff, Tom Grayson, dismissed the stories as superstition. He was a practical man, not one to believe in ghosts or curses. But even he couldn't explain what happened to his deputy, John Harris. John had been sent to investigate reports of strange lights in the woods one night. When he didn't return, Tom went looking for him. He found John's patrol car parked on the side of the road, the driver's side door hanging open. The radio crackled with static, and John's flashlight lay on the ground, its bulb shattered. There was no sign of the deputy. He was never seen again. The incidents escalated, and the town grew more fearful. People stopped going near the woods, even during the day. Children were forbidden to play outside after dark. Churches held prayer meetings, asking for protection from whatever evil had taken hold of Rosedale. But the woods remained, dark and silent, as if waiting. One night, Dale Klein, the husband of the missing schoolteacher, decided he'd had enough. Consumed by grief and anger, he grabbed his shotgun and marched into the forest, determined to find his wife or whatever had taken her. He left a note behind, scrawled on a piece of paper, "I'm going to end this." He was never seen again. The only thing searchers found was his shotgun, broken in half, lying in the clearing where the teenagers had camped months earlier. By the end of the year, Rosedale was a ghost town. Families packed up and left, abandoning their homes and businesses. The few who stayed behind refused to talk about what had happened. The forest reclaimed the edges of the town, creeping closer with each passing year, as if it were swallowing the place whole. Today, Rosedale is nothing more than a collection of crumbling buildings and overgrown streets. But those who visit, urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers, report the same eerie silence, the same feeling of being watched. Some claim to have seen shadowy figures moving among the trees. Others hear whispers, faint and chilling, calling them deeper into the woods. And every so often, someone disappears. Some say it's just an old ghost story, a cautionary tale spun from the imaginations of frightened townsfolk. But others believe there's truth to it, that something ancient and hungry still lingers in those woods, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to wander in. Whatever the case, one thing is certain: Rosedale and its cursed forest remain a mystery. And for those brave or foolish enough to go looking for answers, the question isn't whether they'll find the truth. It's whether they'll make it back out to tell the tale. Though Rosedale had all but vanished from the map, its legend persisted, spreading through whispered conversations and obscure internet forums. Urban explorers and paranormal enthusiasts latched onto the tales, daring each other to visit the ghost town. They shared grainy photos of dilapidated buildings and videos capturing strange anomalies, flickering lights in the distance, faint whispers caught on static-filled audio, and, most chilling of all, shadowy figures darting just out of the camera's view. Among the many thrill seekers who heard of Rosedale, there was a particular group of 4 college students who became obsessed with the story. They were studying folklore and urban legends at a university a few states over, and Rosedale seemed like the perfect field trip. The group consisted of Rachel, the skeptic who believed there was always a logical explanation for everything; David, the tech-savvy one with a knack for capturing paranormal evidence; Sarah, the group's historian who pored over every scrap of information she could find about Rosedale; and Mike, the daredevil who thrived on adrenaline and was always up for a challenge. It was Mike who convinced the others to go. "Think about it," he said, leaning forward with excitement during one of their late-night study sessions. "If we can document Rosedale and figure out what's really going on there, it could be huge. We could write a paper, get published, maybe even make a documentary." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Or we'll just waste a weekend scaring ourselves over nothing." But Sarah was intrigued. "There's a lot of history there," she said, flipping through a printout of old newspaper clippings. "The town dates back to the early 1800s, and there were reports of strange disappearances even back then. It's not just Martha Klein and the others. This goes way back." David added, "And if we don't find anything, at least we'll get some cool footage out of it. I just got a new thermal camera. We could use it to check for cold spots, maybe even catch some movement." Reluctantly, Rachel agreed to join them. "Fine," she said, "but when we come back with nothing but mosquito bites, you all owe me dinner." The following weekend, they packed up their gear: cameras, flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough supplies to last a couple of days, and made the 5-hour drive to Rosedale. The closer they got, the more deserted the area became. The paved roads gave way to gravel and then to dirt. Cell service dropped off entirely. By the time they reached the outskirts of the town, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the crumbling remnants of buildings. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared out the window at what was left of Rosedale. The town looked frozen in time, as if the people had simply vanished one day, leaving their homes and businesses to decay. Vines snaked up the sides of buildings, and weeds sprouted through cracks in the pavement. Mike parked the car, and they climbed out, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. "It's quiet," David said, turning in a slow circle. "Too quiet." Rachel smirked. "Wow, how original. Did you read that line in a horror novel?" But even she couldn't deny the eerie atmosphere. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds at all except for the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. They unloaded their gear and began exploring, filming everything as they went. The first few hours were uneventful. They wandered through abandoned houses, finding little more than broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. Sarah pointed out relics of the town's past, a rusted tricycle lying on its side, a calendar from 1989 still hanging on a wall, frozen in time. David set up his thermal camera in one of the larger buildings, an old general store, but it didn't pick up anything unusual. As night fell, they made their way toward the edge of the woods. "This is where it all supposedly happened," Sarah said, consulting a hand-drawn map she'd found online. "Martha Klein disappeared somewhere around here, and so did the others." Mike grinned. "Perfect. Let's set up camp." Rachel hesitated. "Do we really have to camp here? Can't we just go back to one of the houses?" "What's the matter?" Mike teased. "Afraid of the big bad woods?" She glared at him, but didn't argue. They pitched their tents in a small clearing just inside the tree line, the same spot where the teenagers had camped all those years ago. David set up his cameras, pointing them toward the forest, while Sarah documented their setup in a notebook. The first few hours of the night passed without incident. They sat around a small fire, sharing stories and joking to ease the tension. But as the hours dragged on, the laughter faded, replaced by a growing unease. The silence of the woods was absolute, pressing in on them like a physical weight. Around midnight, David's thermal camera picked up movement. "Guys, look at this," he said, pointing at the screen. A faint, humanoid figure appeared in the distance, its form blurry and indistinct. It stood completely still, just beyond the range of their flashlights. "What is that?" Sarah whispered. Mike grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but there was nothing there. "It's probably just a glitch," Rachel said, though her voice lacked confidence. David shook his head. "It's not a glitch. It's moving." The figure on the screen began to shift, stepping closer, though it still wasn't visible to the naked eye. Then the camera went dead, the screen flickering to black. "Damn it," David muttered, fiddling with the buttons. "It shouldn't just shut off like that." Before anyone could respond, they heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal, but deeper and more resonant. It echoed through the trees, sending chills down their spines. Mike stood up, gripping a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. "Stay here," he said. "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't go out there." But Mike was already moving toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others watched as his beam of light disappeared into the trees. Minutes passed. Then they heard him scream. The sound was raw and primal, filled with terror. It was followed by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush, moving fast. The three remaining friends huddled together, their flashlights darting in every direction. "Mike," Rachel called, her voice trembling. There was no response. When the sound of movement stopped, they ventured into the woods, calling his name. They found his flashlight lying on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. Of Mike, there was no sign, only a set of deep, parallel gashes carved into the tree trunk nearby, oozing sap like blood. They ran back to the campsite, throwing their gear into their bags. "We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Now." But as they tried to retrace their steps back to the car, they realized they were lost. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the trees closing in around them. No matter which way they turned, they couldn't find the edge. And then they saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing among the trees. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched them. When they turned to run, they found themselves face to face with another figure, identical to the first, and then another and another. The forest was full of them, surrounding the group, closing in slowly. The last thing the camera recorded was Sarah's voice, breathless and trembling. "It's not the woods, it's what's in them." The footage was found months later, buried beneath a collapsed building in Rosedale. Of the 4 students, no trace was ever found. Their disappearance became just another chapter in the town's dark and growing legend. And the woods remained, silent and waiting for the next visitors to step inside. The footage from the students' camera became a sensation when it was leaked online. It spread like wildfire across forums and social media platforms, dissected frame by amateur sleuths and paranormal enthusiasts alike. Theories ranged from government experiments to ancient spirits, cryptids, and even alien activity. But one thing was certain: something unexplainable had happened in Rosedale. The grainy footage of the glowing-eyed figures and the students' final moments fueled countless debates, drawing more attention to the cursed town than ever before. Despite the warnings and the growing list of disappearances, thrill seekers and investigators continued to flock to Rosedale. Some went as skeptics, eager to debunk the claims, while others went in search of proof of the supernatural. Very few returned, and those who did were never the same. They spoke of the forest like it was alive, almost sentient, its shadows moving when they shouldn't, its silence suffocating. Some described hearing whispers in the dead of night, faint and unintelligible, but chilling nonetheless. Others claimed to have seen figures just like the ones in the students' footage, tall, thin, and watching. One such survivor was a man named Carter Ellis, a local journalist who had ventured into the woods in search of answers. Carter had been covering the Rosedale story for years, dismissing it as nothing more than a modern urban legend. But after the student's disappearance, he couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. Armed with a high-powered flashlight, a thermal camera, and a handgun for protection, Carter stepped into the woods on a cold October morning. He was found 3 days later, wandering the road outside Rosedale, disheveled and muttering incoherently. His camera was missing and his flashlight and gun were both broken. When asked what had happened, he refused to speak about it, growing agitated whenever anyone mentioned the forest. He quit his job shortly after and moved out of state, becoming a recluse. But before he disappeared from the public eye entirely, he gave one interview to a small paranormal podcast. "They're not ghosts," he said, his voice trembling. "They're not spirits or demons or whatever people think. They're something else, something old, something this world was never meant to hold on to. And they don't like us being there. The woods, they're not a place. They're a trap, a doorway." The cryptic interview only deepened the mystery, and Carter's warning went unheeded. More people ventured into Rosedale, determined to uncover the truth. Among them was a well-funded paranormal investigation team called Spectre Seekers, who planned to live-stream their exploration of the town and forest. They brought state-of-the-art equipment, including motion sensors, infrared cameras, and even a drone. Their audience numbered in the tens of thousands as they began their stream, the chat buzzing with excitement and morbid curiosity. The team's exploration started off smoothly. They moved through the town, showcasing the decayed remnants of life, abandoned homes, an overgrown church, and the skeletal remains of the general store. The chat was filled with comments about the eerie atmosphere, but nothing overtly supernatural occurred. That changed when they reached the edge of the forest. "All right, folks," the team leader Greg said into the camera. "This is where things get interesting. We're going into the woods, where most of the strange activity has been reported. Let's see if the legends are true." The group stepped into the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The chat exploded with comments as the team ventured deeper, their equipment recording everything. For the first hour, nothing happened. The woods were silent and still, the only sounds coming from the team's footsteps and their occasional nervous jokes. Then, one of the motion sensors went off. "What was that?" asked Lisa, the team's tech specialist. She checked the monitor strapped to her wrist, which showed movement detected about 20 feet to their left. Greg swung the camera around, but there was nothing there. "Probably just an animal," Greg said, though his voice wavered. The group pressed on, but the tension was palpable. The motion sensors continued to trigger sporadically, always detecting movement just outside their line of sight. The drone, which had been hovering above them, suddenly lost its signal and crashed to the ground. When they retrieved it, the footage was corrupted, showing nothing but static. As the night wore on, the group began hearing faint noises, footsteps that didn't belong to them, whispers that seemed to come from every direction. The chat grew frantic, viewers urging the team to leave. But Greg insisted on pushing forward, determined to capture definitive evidence. And then they saw them. The first figure appeared just beyond the range of their flashlights, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It was tall and impossibly thin, its arms too long for its body. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stared. Lisa screamed, and the camera jerked as Greg turned to capture the others. The figures were everywhere, surrounding the team. They were identical, their glowing eyes unblinking, their forms unnaturally still. The team panicked, running in different directions, their cameras capturing only chaos as they fled. The live stream cut out abruptly, leaving thousands of viewers staring at a blank screen. The Spectre Seekers were never heard from again. In the weeks that followed, authorities conducted a search of the area but found no trace of the team. Their equipment was recovered near the edge of the forest, smashed and scattered. The live stream footage became the subject of endless speculation, with many claiming it was a hoax. But those who had seen the figures in the stream knew better. The disappearances didn't stop. If anything, they increased. Hikers, campers, and even seasoned hunters vanished without a trace. The forest seemed to grow more aggressive, more hostile. People began reporting strange phenomena miles away from Rosedale, unnatural cold spots, shadowy figures appearing on the edges of roads, and a faint, bone-chilling whisper carried on the wind. The stories culminated in a final, chilling event. Late one night, a truck driver passing through the area called 911 to report a woman standing in the middle of the road. She was barefoot and dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her hair matted with leaves. The driver stopped to help her, but as he approached, she turned and walked into the forest without a word. The driver refused to follow her, but his dashcam captured the entire encounter. When police reviewed the footage, they noticed something horrifying. As the woman stepped into the woods, multiple glowing eyes appeared in the darkness behind her, watching. That was the last straw. The state declared the area around Rosedale off-limits, erecting fences and posting armed guards to keep people out. But the stories didn't stop. People claimed to hear the whispers even miles away, and some swore they saw the glowing eyes in the darkness, watching from the trees. Over time, Rosedale faded into legend, a cautionary tale of curiosity gone too far. But the forest remained, silent and waiting, its secrets buried deep within its shadowed depths. And for those who dared to venture too close, it offered only one promise: they would never leave. Even with the state's firm restrictions and fencing around Rosedale, the legend of the cursed woods continued to grow. Online forums and dark web communities fueled the obsession. Conspiracy theorists speculated that the government knew the truth, but was hiding it. Some claimed that the glowing-eyed figures were not of this world, while others believed they were remnants of an ancient civilization, long forgotten and disturbed by the town's expansion into their sacred land. Despite the warnings and barriers, there were always those who couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. They were drawn like moths to a flame, thrill seekers, paranormal enthusiasts, and desperate souls who believed the forest held answers to their personal struggles or missing loved ones. Most never returned, and the few who did were unable or unwilling to speak of what they'd experienced. One of those few was a man named Henry Voss. Henry was an ex-Marine who had spent years working as a private investigator. His resolve had been hardened by years of chasing missing persons and uncovering dark truths. But even he couldn't shake what had happened to his younger brother, Ethan, who had vanished during a camping trip near Rosedale a decade earlier. The official story was that Ethan had simply gotten lost, like so many others, but Henry never believed it. Ethan was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who could navigate the wilderness without issue. Henry had poured years into searching for him, But every lead brought him back to the same haunting conclusion, the woods of Rosedale. On a cold November night, Henry decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a military-grade flashlight, a satellite phone, a GPS tracker, and his trusty sidearm, he made his way to the forest's perimeter. The fence was easy enough to scale, barely patrolled, as if the authorities themselves didn't want to linger near the cursed place. When his boots hit the forest floor, the atmosphere changed immediately. The air felt heavy, suffused with a silence so deep it seemed to muffle even his own breathing. The forest floor was unnervingly clean, no fallen branches or leaves, as though something unseen kept it pristine. Henry moved cautiously, marking his trail with small reflective markers. He'd learned from years of search and rescue work that the key to survival was knowing how to leave breadcrumbs for yourself. But as he went deeper, he began noticing strange things. The trail markers he'd placed started disappearing, vanishing without a trace. He double-checked his GPS, but the device flickered and froze, unable to get a consistent reading. The satellite phone, too, lost its signal, despite the clear night sky above. Still, Henry pressed on. He was determined not to let the forest play tricks on him. But as the hours passed, he began to notice something disturbing: the trees. They didn't just seem taller and thicker as he ventured deeper, they seemed alive. Their gnarled branches twisted unnaturally, their bark almost appearing to ripple as if it were breathing. Every so often he thought he saw faces in the knots of the trunks, but they vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. And then there were the sounds. At first, it was faint, a low hum, just barely audible, like a tuning fork vibrating in the distance. Then came the whispers. They were soft and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but there was no wind. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, growing louder the further he went. At times they sounded almost like Ethan's voice, calling his name, pleading for help. "Henry," the voice called, faint and broken. "I'm here." He froze. His flashlight beam swept across the forest, but there was nothing. He gritted his teeth. "Ethan," he shouted into the void. His voice echoed back at him, hollow and distorted. Somewhere deep inside, he knew it wasn't his brother. But he couldn't stop himself from following the sound. The whispers led him to a clearing. In the center was a massive oak tree, its trunk impossibly wide, its branches stretching upward like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The ground around the tree was bare, the earth blackened and cracked as if scorched. Henry's heart pounded as he approached, his flashlight trembling in his hand. At the base of the tree he saw something that stopped him cold. A pile of objects, old and decayed. A rusted tricycle, a shattered camera, a torn backpack. These weren't just random items, they were the belongings of those who had disappeared. His breath caught when he saw Ethan's hunting knife among the debris, its blade dulled and its handle weathered. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears welled in his eyes as he reached for the knife, but as his fingers brushed the handle, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, the figures appeared. They emerged from the shadows one by one, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs grotesquely elongated. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. There were dozens of them, encircling the clearing, their eyes fixed on Henry. He raised his gun, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shouted, but the figures didn't flinch. They inched closer, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them raised a hand, pointing at the tree. Henry followed its gesture and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The bark of the oak was covered in faces. Human faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. He recognized some of them from missing persons posters he'd seen over the years. And then he saw Ethan. His brother's face was there, twisted in agony, his eyes pleading. "Help me." Ethan's voice whispered, though his lips didn't move. Henry's mind reeled. He stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. The figures closed in, their whispers returning, louder now, filling his head with incomprehensible words. He fired his gun, the shots echoing through the forest, but the figures didn't stop. The bullets passed through them as if they weren't there at all. Desperate, Henry turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away. The forest seemed to shift around him, the trees closing in, their branches clawing at his clothes. The whispers grew louder, now deafening, drowning out his thoughts. He tripped and fell, his flashlight skittering away, plunging him into darkness. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the side of the road, just outside the fence. His gear was gone, and his clothes were torn and bloodied. He had no memory of how he'd escaped. The only thing he carried was Ethan's knife, its blade now polished and clean, as though it had never been left to rust. Henry left the area that night, vowing never to return. But the horrors of Rosedale stayed with him, haunting his dreams. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face in the tree, couldn't forget the whispers that still seemed to echo in his mind. He tried to warn others, but his story was dismissed as the ramblings of a broken man. Still, the disappearances continued, and the forest remained, silent and waiting, its roots stretching deeper into the earth, its shadows growing darker. Whatever lived in those woods wasn't done. It was patient, it was hungry, and it knew that no matter how many warnings were given, there would always be someone who couldn't resist the call. Because Rosedale wasn't just a place, it was a lure, a trap, and it would never stop taking. Years passed, and the story of Rosedale faded from the public consciousness, pushed into the realm of forgotten urban legends and obscure internet rabbit holes. But the forest didn't forget. It waited, silent and patient, as if biding its time. Those who lived in the surrounding regions still spoke of the cursed woods in hushed tones, warning their children never to stray too close. Yet human curiosity has a way of defying even the most chilling of warnings. It was nearly 20 years after the disappearance of the Spectre Seekers when a new player entered the story of Rosedale. A tech startup called Veil Tech, known for creating cutting-edge virtual reality and augmented reality experiences, announced a bold new project: to digitally map Rosedale and its legendary forest. Using drones, LiDAR scanners, and advanced AI systems, they intended to create an interactive experience that would allow people to explore the haunted town from the safety of their own homes. The announcement sparked outrage among locals who pleaded with the company to leave the forest alone. But Vailtech dismissed their concerns, framing the project as a harmless technological endeavor. "We're not going into this believing in ghosts or curses," their CEO, a man named Alan Royce, said during a press conference. "This is about history, about preserving a piece of folklore and turning it into a virtual experience for people all over the world. It's no different than mapping the ruins of an ancient civilization." The project, dubbed the Rosedale Initiative, was set to launch in 2 phases. Phase 1 would involve deploying a fleet of drones to map the town and the forest in extreme detail, using advanced sensors to capture every inch of the terrain. Phase 2 would involve a small team of Vailtech employees entering the forest to install specialized ground sensors and cameras for an even more immersive experience. Royce assured the public that his team would take every precaution and remain in constant contact with a control center outside the forest. The drones were deployed on a crisp autumn morning. The operation began smoothly, with the fleet buzzing over Rosedale like a swarm of mechanical insects. Their cameras captured stunning footage of the abandoned town, its crumbling buildings, overgrown streets, and eerily pristine forest floor. The data streamed back to Vailtech headquarters in real time, and the team celebrated their progress as the first phase of the mission neared completion. But then, as the drones moved deeper into the forest, strange anomalies began to occur. Some of the drones lost their signal entirely, disappearing from the tracking system without warning. Others sent back distorted footage, trees that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally, shadows that moved against the light, and glimpses of glowing eyes that vanished the moment the camera focused on them. One drone's final transmission showed a figure standing in the clearing near the massive oak tree, staring directly at the camera. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its elongated limbs hung unnaturally at its sides. The footage cut out abruptly, and the drone's signal was lost. The Vailtech engineers, watching the feed from their control center, dismissed the glitches as technical malfunctions caused by dense foliage or electromagnetic interference. Royce insisted they press on, determined not to let ghost stories derail the project. He ordered the team to proceed with Phase 2. The ground team consisted of 5 people, Alan Royce himself, eager to oversee the project firsthand. Emily Carter, a topographer, Raj Patel, a drone operator, Lisa Holloway, a data scientist, and Mark Travis, a former Army Ranger hired for security. They entered the forest early one morning, equipped with high-tech gear and enough supplies to last several days. Each member wore a body camera, and their communications were monitored by the control center on the outskirts of the town. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal. The team installed sensors and cameras at several key locations, marking their progress on a digital map. They joked and laughed, their confidence bolstered by the fact that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But as the day wore on, the forest became unnervingly quiet. The team began to notice an oppressive stillness, as if the woods themselves were listening. "I don't like this," Emily muttered, glancing around nervously. "It feels wrong." "Just nerves," Royce said dismissively. "We'll be out of here in a couple of days, and this will all look silly in hindsight." But as night fell, the unease grew. Strange sounds began echoing through the trees, low whispers, barely audible, just on the edge of perception. Mark, the ranger, insisted it was the wind, but there was no wind. The air was heavy and still. Around midnight, one of the cameras the team had installed sent back a live feed of something moving near the oak tree in the clearing. At first, it was just a shadow, darting between the trees. But then the figure stepped into view, its glowing eyes staring directly into the camera. The feed cut out seconds later. "Did you see that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Tell me that was just an animal." Royce frowned, but remained calm. "Probably a bug or some kind of interference. Let's not jump to conclusions." But the team couldn't ignore what happened next. The motion sensors began triggering one after another, forming a path that seemed to encircle their campsite. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Mark swore he heard his own name being called, followed by laughter, soft and mocking. "Pack up," he said firmly, his hand resting on the gun strapped to his side. "We're leaving now." But it was too late. The figures began to appear, just as they had for the others. At first they were distant, tall, thin shapes blending into the shadows. But they grew closer with each passing moment, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. The whispers rose to a deafening cacophony, filling the team's ears, drowning out their thoughts. Raj panicked and ran, disappearing into the trees despite Mark's shouts to stay together. The others could only watch in horror as his body camera feed captured his frantic movements, the forest blurring around him. Then the camera went static. One by one, the team was picked off. Emily vanished while trying to radio for help. Lisa's screams echoed through the forest before abruptly cutting off. Mark fired his weapon at the figures, but the bullets had no effect. His camera feed showed him being dragged into the darkness by impossibly long arms. Royce was the last. His final transmission was a frantic, breathless whisper. "It's alive. The forest, it's alive. Don't come back. Don't." The feed went dead. The control center lost all contact with the team. Search and rescue missions were launched in the following weeks, but no trace of the Vailtech employees was ever found. The company quietly shut down the Rosedale initiative, scrubbing all mention of the project from their website and issuing vague statements about unforeseen difficulties. But the leaked footage told a different story, one that spread quickly online, reigniting the legend of Rosedale. And still the forest waited, silent and patient. Its whispers grew louder, its shadows darker, as if feeding on the souls it had claimed. Whatever lived within those woods was no longer content to stay hidden. It was growing stronger, spreading, and it was still hungry. It was the kind of story you didn't want to believe, the kind locals only whispered about late at night, afraid of drawing its attention. It all started in a small, forgotten town in the Midwest, a place where most people knew each other by name, but preferred to keep their doors locked tight after sundown. The town of Ridgeline had its fair share of strange occurrences over the years, but none of them compared to what happened in the summer of 1994. That was the summer everything changed, the summer people stopped feeling safe in their own homes. The story begins with a man named James Harlow, a middle-aged locksmith who had lived in Ridgeline his entire life. James was a quiet, unassuming man, the kind who kept to himself and didn't ask too many questions. He had no family to speak of, no close friends, just his work and the occasional nod to a neighbor when passing by. James had always been a reliable man, someone you could trust to fix your locks and make spare keys without ever prying into why you needed them. That's what made him the perfect person to discover the first signs of what was coming. One late June evening, James was called out to a house on the edge of town, a small, crumbling farmhouse that had been abandoned for years. The new owner, a young woman named Claire, had just moved in a few weeks earlier and was already having trouble with the locks. She claimed the front door wouldn't stay locked no matter what she did, and strange noises kept waking her up at night. James arrived just as the sun was setting, his toolbox in hand, ready to fix whatever was wrong. When he reached the house, he noticed something odd right away. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze, even though Claire had sworn she'd locked it before calling him. James knocked, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, calling out for Claire. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and something else he couldn't quite place, something metallic like rust or blood. As James moved through the house, he noticed things weren't quite right. Furniture was overturned, drawers had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor, and the walls were covered in strange, dark stains. He found Claire's phone on the kitchen counter, but there was no sign of her anywhere. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. James wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about this situation made his stomach churn. He called out again, his voice trembling slightly, but there was no response. Against his better judgment, he climbed the creaking staircase, each step echoing in the empty house. The footsteps grew louder as he reached the top, leading him down a long, narrow hallway to a closed door at the end. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. The room was empty, just an old bedroom with faded wallpaper and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. But the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were right above him now, coming from the attic. James stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to go up there, but something compelled him to keep going. The attic door was a pull-down hatch with a rickety ladder. As he reached up to grab the string, a sudden chill ran down his spine, and he could have sworn he heard someone whisper his name. He froze, listening intently, but the whispering stopped. Taking a deep breath, he pulled the hatch open, and the ladder unfolded with a loud creak. The attic was pitch black, the only light coming from his flashlight as he climbed up. The air was thick and suffocating, and the metallic smell was stronger now, almost overpowering. James swept his flashlight across the attic, and that's when he saw it. A pair of eyes staring back at him from the darkness. He stumbled backward, nearly falling off the ladder, as a low, guttural growl filled the air. The thing in the attic lunged toward him, and James dropped his flashlight in his panic, plunging the attic into darkness. He scrambled down the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind him and bolting out of the house without looking back. James never spoke about what he saw that night, but he was never the same after that. He quit his job a few weeks later and moved away from Ridgeline, leaving the townsfolk to wonder what had happened to him. But the story didn't end there. Over the following months, more people in Ridgeline began reporting strange occurrences. Locked doors would be found wide open in the morning, even though they were sure they'd locked them the night before. Pets went missing, their collars found torn and blood-stained in the woods. And then there were the disappearances, people vanishing without a trace, just like Claire. The police searched tirelessly, but found no leads, no evidence, nothing to explain what was happening. One night, a group of teenagers decided to investigate the abandoned farmhouse where Claire had lived, convinced it was haunted. They brought flashlights and a camcorder, determined to catch something on tape. The footage they captured was later found in the woods, the camcorder smashed and covered in blood. The video showed the teens exploring the house, laughing nervously as they joked about ghosts. But as they reached the attic, their laughter turned to screams. The last thing the camera recorded was a shadowy figure lunging toward them before the screen went dark. The town of Ridgeline was never the same after that summer. People moved away in droves, leaving the once thriving community a ghost town. Those who stayed behind refused to talk about what had happened, as if speaking of it might bring it back. The farmhouse still stands to this day, a crumbling relic of the past, but no one dares go near it. Some say the thing that lives there is still waiting, watching, biding its time. Others believe it's long gone, but the fear remains, a lingering shadow over the town. There are those who claim the events of that summer were nothing more than urban legends, stories exaggerated over time to scare children and thrill seekers. But James Harlow's disappearance, the missing pets, the blood-stained camcorder, those are facts, not stories. And if you ever find yourself in Ridgeline, you might feel it too, that sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Maybe it's all in your head. Or maybe, just maybe, the thing that haunted Ridgeline is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And if it is, you'd better hope it doesn't find you. Sure, here's the continuation of the story, keeping the same suspenseful tone intact, as it unfolds further into the mystery of Ridgeline and the horrors tied to the abandoned farmhouse. Despite the ghost town Ridgeline had become, every so often, curiosity seekers would wander through its empty streets. Most were urban explorers, paranormal enthusiasts, or thrill seekers looking to brave the infamous farmhouse. Locals from neighboring towns shared their own variations of the story. Some said it was a demon, others a vengeful spirit, and a few even believed it was something far worse, something that couldn't be named. Whatever it was, the farmhouse was its heart, and the brave, or foolish, who entered it rarely came out the same. One of those people was a man named Kevin, a freelance journalist chasing his next big story. Kevin had heard about Ridgeline through an online forum dedicated to unsolved mysteries. He'd been following a thread about James Harlow's disappearance and the events of 1994 for weeks, piecing together fragments of the story from old newspaper articles and forum posts. The more he read, the more obsessed he became. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or demons, but the disappearances, the camcorder footage, and the eerie silence from the town's remaining residents intrigued him. Something had happened in Ridgeline, and he was determined to find out what. Kevin arrived in Ridgeline on a cloudy afternoon in late October. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves, and the town was eerily quiet, as if the world had forgotten it existed. Most of the buildings were boarded up, their windows shattered, and their walls covered in graffiti. The few houses that still seemed inhabited had overgrown lawns and sagging roofs, their occupants keeping their curtains drawn tight. Kevin parked his car near the town square and stepped out, his camera slung over his shoulder and a notebook in his pocket. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had been building in his chest ever since he'd crossed the town line. It was just a town, he told himself. A weird, creepy, nearly abandoned town, but a town nonetheless. There was no such thing as ghosts or monsters. Whatever had happened here had a logical explanation, and he was going to find it. The farmhouse wasn't hard to find. It sat on the outskirts of town, perched on a small hill like a sentinel overlooking the ruins of Ridgeline. The house was even more dilapidated than Kevin had imagined, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. The front door hung crookedly on its hinges, swinging slightly in the breeze. As he approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the road behind him was empty. Kevin hesitated at the threshold, his hand on the doorknob. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but there was something about the house that made his skin crawl. Steeling himself, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale and heavy, carrying that same metallic tang that James Harlow had smelled all those years ago. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved through the house, his camera clicking as he captured photos of the decaying interior. The living room was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, their edges yellowed with age. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing dark, water-damaged wood beneath. Kevin's footsteps echoed as he walked, the silence of the house almost deafening. He made his way to the kitchen, where he found a rusted refrigerator and a table covered in dust. There was a small door in the corner, slightly ajar, leading down to the basement. Kevin hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but something about that door made his stomach churn. He shook his head, muttering to himself. It was just a basement. There was nothing to be afraid of. He pulled the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, carrying a faint, sour smell that made him gag. He flicked on his flashlight and started down the stairs, his camera held tightly in his other hand. The basement was small and unfinished, with dirt floors and stone walls. The beams overhead were covered in cobwebs, and the only sound was the faint dripping of water from somewhere in the corner. Kevin swept his flashlight across the room, his heart pounding in his chest. At first he thought the basement was empty, but then his beam landed on something in the far corner, a pile of old, tattered clothing. No, not just clothing. Bones. The clothes were draped over small, pale bones, some of them cracked and splintered. Kevin's stomach turned, and he stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the pile, his mind racing. This was real. This wasn't some urban legend or ghost story. Someone, or something, had been using this basement as a dumping ground. He was so focused on the bones that he didn't notice the shadow moving behind him. It wasn't until he felt the cold breath on the back of his neck that he realized he wasn't alone. Kevin spun around, his flashlight catching a glimpse of something tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were sunken, black pits, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth that glistened in the light. It let out a low, guttural growl, and Kevin stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground. He didn't think. He didn't look back. He just ran. Up the stairs, through the kitchen, out the front door, and into the woods beyond. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor. He could still hear it behind him, the sound of its footsteps crunching through the leaves, getting closer and closer. Kevin fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. The operator's voice crackled through the line, but before he could speak, the phone was snatched out of his hand. He looked up, and there it was, standing over him, its empty eyes staring into his soul. The last thing Kevin saw was its jagged teeth descending toward him. Weeks later, Kevin's car was found abandoned near the town square, his camera lying in the passenger seat. The photos on it were too dark to make out much, but one of them, the last one he'd taken, showed a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching. Ridgeline remains abandoned to this day, a place frozen in time, its secrets buried beneath layers of fear and silence. The farmhouse still stands, its doors open, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander inside. And whatever lurks within its walls is still hungry. Kevin's disappearance wasn't the last. Though Ridgeline had become a ghost town, a magnet for urban explorers and thrill seekers, word of his vanishing began to spread. Online forums erupted with speculation. Was it a cult, a serial killer? Or was the farmhouse truly cursed by something darker, unexplainable? Videos of the farmhouse began cropping up on YouTube, most of them shaky and inconclusive, but the comment sections were filled with warnings from people who claimed to know the truth. Some begged others not to go there. Others spoke of a figure in the shadows, a creature that had been seen for decades, but never fully described. Some called it the Ridgeline Wraith, others simply called it It. Among the crowd of online commenters was a man named Marcus. Unlike the others, Marcus wasn't there to speculate or warn anyone. He was there to find answers. Marcus was Claire's brother, the young woman who had vanished in 1994. For over 2 decades, he had been haunted by her disappearance. The police had written her off as a missing person, likely a runaway, but Marcus had never believed that. He knew Claire. She wasn't the type to leave without saying goodbye. And though the farmhouse had been searched, Marcus had always felt like there was something more no one had uncovered, something the town was too afraid to face. For years, Marcus had tried to move on, to let it go, but the disappearance ate away at him. When he stumbled across Kevin's story online, every buried fear and suspicion came rushing back. The photos on Kevin's recovered camera, especially the one with the shadowy figure at the edge of the woods, convinced Marcus there was a connection. Something had happened to Claire in that farmhouse, and now it was happening again. It was mid-November when Marcus decided to drive to Ridgeline. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not his wife, not his friends, not even the small circle of online sleuths he'd been corresponding with. He knew they'd try to stop him, and he wasn't interested in being talked out of it. He packed a bag with a flashlight, a knife, his phone, and a handheld camcorder, and he made the 3-hour drive to the abandoned town. The sun was setting by the time Marcus arrived, casting long shadows across the crumbling buildings. He parked his car on the side of the road, grabbed his bag, and started walking toward the farmhouse. The town felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on him. The only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots, and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. When the farmhouse came into view, Marcus stopped in his tracks. Even in the fading light, it looked wrong. The windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the door hung open, as if inviting him in. He hesitated, his grip tightening on the camcorder. For a moment, he thought about turning back, but then he thought of Claire. Whatever had happened to her, it had started here. He had to know the truth. The first thing Marcus noticed when he stepped inside was the smell. It was worse than he expected. Wet earth, mildew, and that same metallic tang that others had described. The floor creaked under his weight as he moved through the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was empty, the furniture long gone. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, revealing deep gouges in the wood beneath. He ran his fingers across one of the gouges, frowning. It looked like claw marks. The kitchen was just as decrepit, the cabinets hanging off their hinges, the sink filled with stagnant water. Marcus swept his flashlight across the room, and his beam landed on the basement door. It was wide open, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth. He felt a chill run down his spine. He knew from all his research that the basement was where Kevin had found the bones. It was also where James Harlow had heard the footsteps all those years ago. Marcus hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining his flashlight down into the gloom. The air was colder here, and the sour smell was almost unbearable. He took a deep breath, gripping the railing as he descended into the basement. The stairs creaked with every step, and he had the unsettling feeling that something was waiting for him at the bottom. The basement was worse than he'd imagined. The dirt floor was uneven, and the walls were damp with something that glistened in the light. His flashlight caught the pile of bones in the corner, and he felt his stomach turn. They were small, fragile, human, but not adult. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached for one of the bones. It was cracked and brittle, but there was no mistaking what it was. As he stood up, his flashlight caught something else, scratches on the stone wall, faint but deliberate. He moved closer, his breath hitching as he realized they were words carved hastily into the stone. It watches, it waits, it feeds. Marcus's heart was pounding now. He backed away from the wall, his flashlight darting across the basement. That's when he saw the hatch. It was small and metal, set into the floor on the far side of the room. The edges were rusted, and the handle was covered in dirt, but it was unmistakably a door. He'd never heard anyone mention a hatch in the basement before. Was this what everyone had missed? He approached it cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The hatch was locked, but the lock itself was old and brittle. He grabbed the knife from his bag and jammed it into the mechanism, twisting until he heard a snap. The lock fell away, and Marcus hesitated for only a moment before pulling the hatch open. A wave of cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it a smell so foul that Marcus gagged. He shone his flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into the earth. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was slick with some kind of black sludge. He could see faint footprints in the sludge, leading deeper into the tunnel. Marcus knew he should leave. Every instinct was screaming at him to get out of the house, to get back in his car and never look back. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he'd seen. If Claire was down there, or whatever was left of her, he had to know. He climbed down into the tunnel, the walls closing in around him. The air was so cold that his breath fogged in front of him, and the sound of his footsteps echoed unnervingly. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until he lost all sense of direction. He was just about to turn back when he heard it, whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. But as he moved deeper into the tunnel, it grew louder. It wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping and indistinct like a chorus of the damned. Marcus's flashlight flickered and he smacked it against his palm, cursing under his breath. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and suddenly the light went out completely. Marcus froze in the darkness, his heart pounding in his ears. The whispering was all around him now, so loud it felt like it was inside his head. And then, from the darkness, he heard something else, breathing, slow, deliberate, and far too close. He turned to run, but something grabbed him, pulling him off his feet. His scream echoed through the tunnel, cut off abruptly as he was dragged into the darkness. Marcus was never seen again. His car was found a week later, parked in the same spot near the town square. His camcorder was inside, but the footage was corrupted, filled with static and distorted images. The last frame, frozen and grainy, showed the hatch in the basement, wide open. Ridgeline remains abandoned, its secrets buried beneath layers of fear and silence. And the farmhouse still waits, its doors open, inviting the curious and the desperate. Whatever lurks beneath it is still there, watching, waiting, feeding, and it always hungers for more. Months passed after Marcus's disappearance, and the story of Ridgeline began to fade once again into obscurity. Online forums fell silent, the chatter dying down as new mysteries and conspiracies took their place. The world, it seemed, was content to forget about Ridgeline, to let it sink back into the shadows. But there were still a few who couldn't let it go. Among them was Sarah, a true crime podcaster who had built a reputation for solving cold cases. Sarah had heard about Ridgeline through a listener who had emailed her about Marcus's disappearance. Intrigued, she began digging into the story, piecing together the timeline of events, from Claire's vanishing in 1994 to Kevin's disappearance and the unsettling discovery of Marcus's abandoned car. The more she uncovered, the deeper the mystery became. There were no clear answers, only fragments of a story that didn't quite add up. And then there was the farmhouse. Every thread led back to that crumbling house on the hill, the place where it had all started. Sarah was skeptical of the supernatural claims, but she couldn't deny that something strange was happening in Ridgeline. She decided to investigate the story for herself, documenting her journey in real time for her podcast. In early January, Sarah packed her car with recording equipment, a portable generator, and enough supplies for a few days. She wasn't going alone. Her producer and best friend, Mark, insisted on joining her. Mark was less enthusiastic about the trip, but he knew Sarah well enough to realize she wouldn't back down. If she was determined to go to Ridgeline, he wasn't about to let her face it alone. The drive to Ridgeline was uneventful, the landscape growing more desolate as they approached the town. Snow covered the ground, muffling the sound of their footsteps as they stepped out of the car. Sarah set up her microphone, recording her impressions as they walked through the empty streets. The houses were silent, their windows dark and lifeless. It felt like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When they reached the farmhouse, Sarah's confidence faltered. Seeing it in person was different from reading about it or looking at photos online. The house loomed over them, its broken windows staring like empty eyes, its door hanging open as if inviting them inside. Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his breath visible in the icy air. Sarah hesitated, but only for a moment. "We've come this far," she said, her voice steady. "We can't turn back now." They stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath their boots. Sarah held up her recorder, describing the decay of the house, the peeling wallpaper, the broken furniture, the faint smell of mildew and rust. Mark followed close behind, holding a flashlight that flickered slightly as they moved deeper into the house. The basement door was exactly as Sarah had imagined it, small, unassuming, and slightly ajar. She paused in front of it, her hand resting on the doorknob. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper, so soft she couldn't be sure if it was real or just her imagination. She glanced at Mark, who gave her a reluctant nod. The stairs groaned beneath their weight as they descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of decay grew stronger. Sarah's flashlight revealed the same dirt floor and stone walls that Marcus had described in his notes. The pile of bones was still there, undisturbed, and the scratches on the wall were even more ominous in person. It watches, it waits, it feeds, Sarah read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a chill down her spine. Mark shone his flashlight across the room, and his beam landed on the hatch. "That must be it," he said, his voice trembling. Sarah approached the hatch cautiously, her recorder still running. The metal was rusted and pitted, the handle streaked with grime. She knelt down, running her fingers along the edges. It looked old, far older than the house above it, as if it had been there long before the farmhouse was built. "Do you think it leads to another basement?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "Only one way to find out," Sarah replied. She pulled the hatch open, revealing the same narrow tunnel Marcus had described. The air that rose from it was frigid and heavy, carrying the unmistakable stench of death. Mark recoiled, covering his nose and mouth. This is a bad idea, Sarah." But Sarah was already climbing down, her flashlight illuminating the slick walls of the tunnel. "We didn't come all this stop now," she said. "Stay close." Reluctantly, Mark followed her, his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The tunnel was just as claustrophobic as Marcus had described, the ceiling low enough that they had to crouch as they moved deeper underground. The walls were rough stone, covered in strange, dark stains that looked disturbingly like handprints. As they ventured further, the whispering began. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But as they moved deeper, it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't words exactly, but a jumble of voices overlapping, rising and falling in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Just keep moving." The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and both of them froze. The room was massive, the walls lined with what looked like ancient carvings, symbols and figures that seemed to twist and shift in the flickering light of their flashlights. The floor was littered with bones, some of them human, others unrecognizable. And in the center of the room was a massive stone altar, slick with something dark and wet. Sarah approached the altar cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The carvings on its surface were intricate and grotesque, depicting scenes of ritualistic sacrifice and shadowy figures consuming their victims. She felt a wave of nausea roll over her, but she couldn't look away. And then she heard it, the breathing. Low, guttural, and impossibly loud, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Mark spun around, his flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing there. "Sarah, we need to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could respond, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a weight. And then, from the darkness beyond the altar, something moved. It was massive, its form shifting and indistinct, as if it were made of shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin points of light that seemed to pierce through Sarah. It let out a low, guttural growl, and the air in the chamber grew colder. "Run," Sarah whispered, grabbing Mark's arm. "Run!" They sprinted back through the tunnel, the sound of the creature's footsteps reverberating behind them. The walls seemed to close in, the whispering rising to a deafening crescendo. Mark tripped, falling hard onto the ground, and Sarah turned back, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. The creature was closer now, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the darkness. They scrambled up the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind them. For a moment, everything was silent. And then the whispering began again, louder this time, as if it were inside their heads. The house shuddered, the walls groaning as if something massive were moving beneath them. Sarah and Mark didn't wait to find out what it was. They ran out of the farmhouse and into the woods, the sound of the creature's growl following them. When they finally reached their car, they didn't look back. They drove for hours, not stopping until they were miles away from Ridgeline. Sarah never released the recordings. She deleted the files, burned her notes, and refused to speak about what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears the whispering, and deep beneath the farmhouse, the creature waits, its hunger growing. It always does. Months passed since Sarah and Mark barely escaped the farmhouse, but neither of them truly left Ridgeline behind. Sarah, despite her best efforts to move on, found herself plagued by nightmares. They always began the same way. She was back in the tunnel, the air thick with the stench of death, the whispering growing louder and louder. until the glowing eyes emerged from the darkness. She would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. No matter how many times she told herself it wasn't real, or that she was safe now, the dreams never stopped. Mark fared no better. The experience had broken something inside him. He quit the podcast, withdrew from his friends and family, and refused to talk about what had happened. Sarah tried calling him a few times, hoping they could support each other, but he never answered. When she finally went to his apartment, she found it abandoned. His landlord told her he'd packed up and left in the middle of the night without saying a word to anyone. No forwarding address. No goodbye. Sarah told herself to let it go. Whatever was in Ridgeline, whatever was lurking beneath that farmhouse, it was better left alone. But a part of her couldn't stop thinking about it. She would spend hours researching obscure symbols and carvings, trying to make sense of what she'd seen in that underground chamber. What was the creature? Was it human once? A demon? Something older? And why Ridgeline? Why that farmhouse? Why did it draw people in only to destroy them? The questions consumed her. Day by day, she felt herself unraveling. She couldn't focus on her work, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The whispering from the farmhouse seemed to follow her, faint at first, like an echo in the back of her mind, but growing louder as the days went on. Some nights, she swore she could hear it coming from the walls of her apartment. She checked them obsessively, pulling away the plaster to reveal nothing but empty space. But the whispering always came back. Eventually, she did the one thing she swore she'd never do again. She went back to Ridgeline. This time, she didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't bring a partner, didn't load up her car with recording equipment or supplies. She only brought a flashlight, a knife, and a small notebook. If she was going to find answers, she needed to face the farmhouse alone. When she arrived, the town was even more desolate than she remembered. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling her footsteps as she made her way toward the hill. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette stark against the gray sky. As she approached, she felt the familiar weight pressing down on her chest, the sense that she was being watched. She stopped at the threshold, staring into the gaping doorway. The whispering began almost immediately, soft and subtle, like a breeze rustling through dead leaves. Sarah clenched her fists, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The house was exactly as she'd left it, though the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. She made her way to the basement door, her flashlight sweeping across the peeling wallpaper and rotting floorboards. The door was closed this time, but she could feel the cold air seeping out from the cracks. She opened it slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The stairs stretched down into darkness, and she hesitated for a moment before descending. The basement was the same. Dirt floor, stone walls, a pile of bones still untouched in the corner. But the hatch was gone. The floor where it had been was smooth, undisturbed, as if it had never existed. Sarah's heart sank. She stared at the spot where the hatch should have been, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whispering grew louder, filling the room like a chorus of voices overlapping, rising and falling in a way that made her stomach churn. "I know you're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid of you." The whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a physical force. And then she heard it, the breathing. It was slow and deliberate, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the basement, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay was almost overwhelming now. She backed toward the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the basement was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, she wasn't alone. The creature stood in the far corner, its form shifting and indistinct, like a shadow given shape. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and it let out a low growl that shook the walls. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight falling from her hand and clattering to the floor. She scrambled up the stairs, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind her. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air burning her lungs. She turned back toward the house, expecting to see the creature emerging from the doorway, but the house was silent and still. The whispering was gone. The air was calm. but Sarah knew it wasn't over. She got in her car and drove away, her hands shaking on the wheel. She didn't stop until she was miles from Ridgeline, pulling over on the side of the road to catch her breath. She sat there for a long time, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. And that's when she saw it, the glowing eyes staring back at her from the back seat. The car was found the next morning, abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's door was open, and the engine was still running. There was no sign of Sarah, but her notebook was found on the passenger seat. The last entry read, "It followed me." Ridgeline remains abandoned, its streets empty, its buildings crumbling. The farmhouse still stands, a silent sentinel on the hill, waiting for its next visitor. Some say the thing inside is growing stronger, that its reach is no longer confined to the house. Others say it's always been that way, and the house is just the gateway. And if you ever find yourself near Ridgeline, you might feel it too, that sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. And if you hear the whispering, it's already too late, because it watches, it waits, and it feeds.